Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to welcome you to Fraud Prevention Webinar, the last in a series of webinars led by the UAE Banks Federation for this year. And we look forward to organizing another series of webinars during 2022. My name is Walid Abu Zaki, the Executive Director of Al-Iqtisad wal-A'mal and the CEO of Unlock Blockchain. The past 2 years have been a landmark for the banking sector. They marked the launch of a number of virtual banks, while conventional banks had to make changes to meet customer demand within a very short time to launch or expand digital and online financial services. Although this has brought huge benefits, we saw increased level of online fraud and cybercrime. And if you allow me to pass this note, most of fraud attempts are happening when the client is using the traditional channels like emails, social channels, or even WhatsApp to communicate his cases with the bank. Saying this because it happened to me personally. So using non-secure platform to communicate banking details is the main glitch. Anyways, I'm sure that we will be covering this during this webinar. With that in mind, Fraud Prevention Webinar tackles digital fraud through 3 different panel discussion with a great lineup of speakers. Before we get started, please be informed that this webinar is recorded and we are broadcasting on both platforms, Zoom and LinkedIn. If you have any queries, our team is happy to answer you in the chat box. And also please note that moderators will allocate the last few minutes of their panel's discussion to answer your question. Therefore, kindly make sure to type your question in the Q&A section after mentioning your full name and the organization you represent. Now, let's kick off the webinar, and I would like to welcome UBF Director General, Mr. Jamal Saleh, for a welcome speech. Mr. Jamal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Walid. Good morning, everybody. As Mr. Walid told us, this is the last of 2021's series of fraud prevention events done in cooperation with our fraud prevention committee. I'm not sure if all of you know, we have many UBF committees handling all the aspects of banking, one of which is the Fraud Prevention Committee, which is led by First Abu Dhabi Bank, Charanjit. And we have been working heavily since the beginning of the COVID crisis and even before. We noticed an increase when people started using digital payments more during COVID. Therefore, we launched last year the first fraud prevention campaign, which covered all sorts of media and communication, and decided to renew it in 2021. So now we are in the middle of this awareness campaign. The problem that we continue to see, as Walid said about the digital channels, but there's another channel which is, we believe, the weakest. And that is the social engineering part, when they don't need to infiltrate your computer or your mobile. They just call you. They call you and either scare you or entice you to divulge information, and then that information is used to siphon your money out. I see a lot of cases every day, some of which are heartbreaking, where people lose all their life saving or their whole account balance. That's not unacceptable. We are working heavily with the authorities in the UAE, so the Abu Dhabi Police, Dubai Police, the TDRA, the CID, Ministry of Interior, all of them, of course the central bank, all of them are working closely with us on trying to stop and minimize fraud. However, you could build all sorts of controls, but when it comes to someone calling you and asking you to give the card details, the CVV, the OTP, and so forth. No automated control can stop that. For that, only awareness can help. We need people to be aware that no bank will call them from a mobile number to seek confidential information. No authority or police or central bank will send them a message saying that your account is blocked or your ID is to be renewed and therefore you must go here and what have you. We need to spread awareness among our people, our citizens, our residents in the UAE. And one excellent way is this way, the way all of you will share information today. So please have a good day today, share information, and once you finish, try to spread this information as much as you can within your own circles, within your own banks, and let's make sure that all our customers are as protected and as aware as all of us. So have a good day and good luck today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jamal. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Charanjit Singh, Chairman of UAE Banks Federation Fraud Prevention Committee, who is also the Senior Vice President, Head of Group Fraud Risk and Investigation at First Abu Dhabi Bank. Charanjit, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Walid. Good evening all, and good afternoon if some of you are joining from outside UAE in certain geographies. Thank you, Mr. Jamal, for allowing us this platform through UBF. We have been working very closely with other stakeholders in UAE, which includes UBF, TRA, Central Bank of UAE, as well as law enforcement, to raise awareness with regards to fraud and also bring out policy changes through regulator, which is Central Bank, as well as telecom regulator, because we noted that collaboration is the key. If we believe that we just work on stopping fraud at our respective banks, then we are not removing fraud, because fraud, it's like water. Today, one bank puts up some control, it will flow to another bank which has weaker control. So it follows the path of least resistance. And collaboration is the best way. We all learn from each other, we follow best practices, and we learn what can go wrong so that something which has happened at one institution doesn't reoccur at another institution. Before we get into the webinars, we have three sections to this program. And we have a panel of experts from across the globe. We have experts from UAE, from Sweden, from UK, from India, and all of them are stalwarts in their respective fields. We have tried to cover key aspects which can affect fraud, which can affect bank as well as customers. So look forward to having these sessions. Couple of things I would want to highlight, what we have been able to achieve with collaboration of all stakeholders, along with the Fraud Prevention Committee of UBF, which is joined by 12 member banks of UAE. We have been able to engage with TRA, and most of you would be seeing that now when you get a call, you see the name of the caller. So that was a TRA initiative when we started discussing with them that people impersonate as banks, as police. They implemented this control that whenever a call comes on mobile, they display the number of the caller, they display name of the caller along with number. So that tells people that if somebody is saying I'm calling from UAE police, but the number doesn't show UAE police, then person knows that it is not a genuine call. Likewise, we worked with legal committee of UBF to roll out a standardized indemnity format, because we realize one problem we all banks face is each bank has a separate format for indemnity, which we require from the remitting bank before we return the funds based on fraudulent recall. So we worked with legal committee, we worked with UBF, and we finalized a standard legal indemnity format. We were also able to roll out UAE PNG process, which prohibits any staff of a bank who commits fraud from joining another bank in UAE. Again, it's a matter of reporting and checking. So if some banks, they decide not to report, then other bank will not know. As I mentioned earlier, collaboration is the key to fight fraud. Some of the things which are under progress with AECB as well as Central Bank is having a fraud flag reporting for lending customers. This covers SME as well as retail individuals, and a fraudster who commits fraud with bank X can now get reported to AECB. So when they apply with another bank, that other bank would see this flag. This flag won't be visible to the customers, and we have inbuilt governance mechanism so that it is not misused to punish any victims of ID theft. Some other things on which we are working is continuing the collaboration piece. We are working with central bank to have a platform where banks can share information on real time about frauds. This would include personally identifiable information as well as fraud trends. We realize that this is a major barrier due to the local laws and lack of any platform, that banks are not able to communicate freely. There are informal collaboration which take place, but it is limited among few banks and done on need to know basis. But having a platform with blessings of central bank would facilitate information sharing in a more formal manner. That's it from my end. Thank you all for joining. Thank you our speakers, and I would Walid hand it over to you so that we can begin the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. We start with our first panel discussion for today, Fraud in a New World of Digital Payments. Please welcome with me the moderator of this panel, Ms. Nasreen Sabri, who is Regional Head of EMEA Fraud Management at HSBC. Nasreen, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks Ola, and thanks Mr. Jamal and Charanjit for this opportunity, and Mr. Walid as well. As Ola said, today's session is on fraud in a new world of digital payments. As you all know, payment fraud through digital channel had been one of the emerging risks globally for a few years now. But due to the shift in customers' behavior due to the pandemic, what we've seen that the customers are becoming more comfortable with using digital channels. But unfortunately, the bad actors took advantage of this and started exploring this channel as well further. Therefore, this emerging risk now had been evolving, and I think steadily it's moving to be one of our top fraud risks that we've seen globally. And majority to two reasons, I believe. First, it's due to the high value transactions that are getting compromised. And the other bit is that we as financial institutions are moving steadily in transforming to digital, which is a great thing to do, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we have the right level of controls to protect our customers. So the main question to answer is, how to be prepared against such attack vector? With us today, we have three panelists with diverse experience who will help us to answer those questions. With me is Vinay, Sheetal, and Nat Kumar. Please open your videos and welcome to this session. If you don't mind, please introduce yourself. We'll start with Sheetal.
Sorry, didn't realize I have actually muted myself. So yeah, as we say ladies first, so myself, Sheetal Bharadwaj, and it's a privilege to be a part of this panel and be among such fine leaders in the industry. I have worked in a Middle Eastern country for almost been 17 years, 15 years into compliance and fraud industry. Recently migrated to New Zealand. I work with Bank of New Zealand now, and I have set up the financial crime risk department there. So that's about myself. Been seasoned in this market for a long time and have seen this industry growing. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheetal. Nat Kumar.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Nandakumar Sarvade. I work as an independent advisor on security, ethics, fraud, and a few other things. I recently retired after a long career in, we started with law enforcement, and I worked in the Indian Police Service, including a stint in the Central Bureau of Investigation, which involved investigating bank frauds. Subsequently, I joined the private sector, and I was working with a couple of large banks in India. And my last stint has been with running a technology company for the central bank in India, that is the Reserve Bank, called Rebit, which provided internal technology services to RBI and also provided technology examination wherewithal for the RBI teams. Happy to be here and interact with the participants.
Thanks. Vinay. You're on mute, Vinay.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Morning. And I'm pleased to join my fellow panelists on this discussion today. I'm the head of fraud risk at Commercial Bank of Dubai. Over the last 18 years, I've had the privilege of working across the globe in various markets, including US, Canada, Africa, as well as Russia and the Middle East. And I'm here to share my knowledge and thought on this topic here today. And I hope there are some takeaways at the end of this session today.
Thanks for the three of you, and welcome for this session. We would start asking some questions, but I would request from all the attendees that, as Walid said initially, that there is a Q&A tab at the bottom. So please put in your questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. At the same time, I would ask each panelist a question, but other panelists, please feel free to pitch in and provide your views, as we all know that you have a great experience to share. So I'll start with you, Vinay. It's not ladies first anymore, Sheetal. Okay, in today's time, with banking landscape moving to digital and the increased fraud witnessed around social engineering, phishing, smishing, vishing, you name it, what are the current and future capabilities you advise financial institutions to consider in order to mitigate fraud, but at the same time, to have a balanced customer experience for our customers who are using those channels?
Sure, that's a great question, right? See, over the last decade, we have seen a shift in the way consumers actually interact with the bank. It's moved from physical to more digital, right? And a combination of both, right? Now, basically, this change is globally. It is driven by the adoption of mobile devices, and what we have seen in the pandemic, and what you did mention earlier, is that there has been an uptake in digital channels for all the banks, right? So today, customers, they transact, through the digital channels. They apply for products and services, and even like complex products like mortgages. Now, what does that mean for banks from a fraud prevention strategy perspective, right? It means that we need to have a more dynamic fraud prevention strategies, a strategy which is more digitally driven and which can cope with the new and emerging trends. And that's something which can be achieved only by having the right tools in place, right? So today we need to have a digital footprint of our customer or create a digital avatar. Basically, taking the device intelligence, right? So basically each customer, they use one device. Some banks, they allow customers to use multiple devices. So gathering the device intelligence, like for example, if the connection is coming from a risky connection, so like there are known IPs from where you get frauds, or there are certain locations across the globe from where you get the frauds coming in. So how can you get the device intelligence if it's a jailbroken device, or if the right security is not there on the device? So that's basically what you call as a risky connection, right? So then using behavior biometrics, right? So what basically enhances is capturing the user behavior. So such as the way you type, the way you hold your phone. So whenever you see there's a change in a pattern, so that is an indication that probably that's an account takeover fraud, or your customer is a victim of probably a phishing or smishing attack. And behavioral analytics, right? So at the time when the consumer normally transacts, right, the time they apply for a product, the location they are normally in. So when you identify there are anomalies in these, so that's where you actually use risk-based authentication, right? So you have to balance the consumer experience and the fraud prevention strategies, right? So it has to be a combination of both, and this can only be achieved by using the right tools. And the other thing is the trust consortium. So basically, not just new customers, even your existing customers, right? So for example, new accounts, you may have accounts which have been just open for the purpose of receiving fraud proceeds, right? So when you see maybe at the onboarding stage you've not detected, but at a later stage you would see that the customer is logging in from a device which is known, you have previously received a fraud. Now these are the things which you need to use and combine this data, the digital footprint, to prevent fraud. And this can only be achieved by having the right tools in place. And the most important piece is for banks who are actually embarking on this journey on the digital space is to map your each journey. So if you look at your mobile channels today, your each, like for example, if you look at your utility bill payment versus international fund transfer versus a domestic fund transfer or applying for a product, each journey is different. So you need to map these journeys. You have to interact with your customer experience team, and you need to balance it to make sure that you have the right controls in place.
Thanks, Vinay. Very, very comprehensive answer. And to be fair, you've touched everything I could think of as well. So thanks a lot. We'll go to Sheetal now. Sheetal, have you seen a shift in a customer's behavior towards payments post-pandemic? And what do you think are the main drivers? You're on mute as well.
Apologies, the person I speak less, so I always put by default on mute. Apologies to everybody. Yeah, so there has been a significant shift in the customer behavior towards payment, not only post-pandemic, during pandemic as well. So this has been experienced on an individual as well as on an organization-based level. So COVID-19 has dramatically accelerated the rate of digital adoption in the financial services, causing abnormal changes in the human behavior and forcing new ways of working. There was a study done last year by Deloitte, which says in US, 35% of the customers across bank have increased their online banking usage during COVID-19. And Visa saw more than 13 million customers in Latin America itself make their first ever online transaction. There was another study which I was reading done by the World Bank Group at the University of Cambridge on the fintech solution. It was identified that there was a significant increase in the fintech usage with the financial institution and the regulator themselves. So that report talks about the emerging and the developing economies, and it also touched base on the developed market. It says digital payments and the remittances, digital savings or deposits, payment or digital banks saw significant rise in emerging markets or developing economies, whereas insurtech, wealth tech, crypto asset exchanges, and digital custody saw a substantial increase in the developed markets. Now let's talk about the online payment. The world after the coronavirus will be very, very different place. As the shockwaves subside, people debate what the new normal will look like. The significant repercussion for globalization, urbanization, and the foreign trades will take years, if not decades, to unfold. In the meantime, brands are focusing on better understanding what customer wants and need during this transition. We'll also talk about the customer experience here. So multiple lockdowns. It's not only one lockdown, which was last year. There are numerous lockdowns, and still it's an ongoing process. And social distancing rule that have been characterized by the COVID-19 period worldwide created a surge in online shopping and the mass adoption of digital-based shopping. Customer behavior such as curbside pickup, grocery, restaurants, and delivery by BOPIS, which is buy online and pick up in store. So there was a survey done by the Global Web Index in which nearly 50% of the people said they won't visit stores for some time, or at least for a long time. I think we are getting in the comfort level now. It's a new normal. While it's reasonable to expect that customer will return to the stores after this restriction might ease, it is also safe to assume that in-store visits will reduce overall, perhaps into the next year as customers want to see how the situation pans out. We've also seen the contactless payments. So even as a person, when I used to put in my own credit card, I'm avoiding to give my card to somebody. I'm moving to Apple Pay. I'm moving to contactless payments. So during the coronavirus period, customers are looking for the ways to reduce the risk of contaminations, like wearing gloves in the supermarket or moving to online shopping to minimize physical contact with merchandise. Another consequence that has been a trend towards contactless payments, such as e-wallets and tap credit cards. This is a preferred payment method for many stores and their customers. Until the virus is entirely eradicated or controlled, safety measures such as these will become more common. Thanks to their convenience and ease of use, they may just stick even after the crisis is well over. We've also seen the surge in the B2B payment. It's another trend which observed during the pandemic which is the rise in the B2B payments. Because people could no longer meet to sign contracts, there was a significant increase in the digitalization in this space. In addition, we have also seen a shift in the payment methods used B2B transaction. SWIFT and SEPA payments do take days to complete. So business is adopting instant payment methods such as bank transfer. So if you ask me to conclude, I'll say that new payment methodologies like wallet payments, cryptocurrency, etc., have changed the dynamics of traditional banking. As we say, necessity is the mother of invention. This pandemic has acted as a catalyst to push more people to adopt the new way of transacting and doing business. So if you see back in 2003, digital payments and the e-commerce launched in China in response to the SARS virus, and it was to avoid the human contact, and it has only grew after that. So we have to keep in mind that these payment methods have not developed only due to pandemic. They address specific customer needs besides just the avoidance of contact. These methods are easier to use as they only require a fingerprint, a retina scan or the eye scan, face scan, or just an email address. There is a genuine concern that the electronic payment methods may expose people and their data to fraud or misuse, particularly with the payment apps. Phones can be hacked, they can be cloned, applications are not 100% secure. Nevertheless, bank and payment providers should be fast-tracking their digital innovation efforts and ramping up their analytics and data management tools. As most customers shift to the digital and mobile payments, there will be a greater demand of security, privacy, and controls of one's data. Yeah.
Thanks, Sheetal. And to be fair, I think all of us as customers, we shifted dramatically in using digital. Like, we don't go to grocery anymore. We don't go to the malls anymore. Everything can come immediately to the house.
Right.
So we as human beings, we all shifted to going digital, and it's great. Who would imagine that, like, I'll go only with my mobile and do all my shopping only with using a mobile, and that's it.
True.
So it's an evolution, and it's interesting, but as we said, it's the right balance.
Right.
Nat Kumar, so what's your advice? So I'll move a bit from payments and so on. I'll just move a bit to a new revolution, which is digital currency and cryptocurrencies and so on. So what's your advice in relation to customers' increased interest in the initial coin offering, and what's your view of digital coins?
Right. So I just wanted to add something to the previous speaker's very comprehensive discussion of this scenario in digital frauds. As we know, in the classic fraud triangle, there is the opportunity and there is motivation as the two key angles which are to be covered. In the pandemic, the informal sector has really got affected because of the kind of lockdown and other things which have come up. So the motivation levels for people to some people to make ends meet is very, very high. And with people staying at home, they are very used to people coming to deliver things and so on. So I was recently hearing a case in India where there's an old man who lives on his pension beyond 90, and somebody comes and says, I'm from your bank, and we have to install this new app on your phone so that you can do your banking more safely. And the person believes him, and then a remote access tool is installed, and then a lot of funds get transferred. So the supply side of crime also needs to be kept in mind when we want to look at countermeasures. Well, coming back to the question that you posed me, I think cryptocurrency, crypto assets is a area of great interest to everyone, and everyone and their aunt are trying to invest into this area, wanting to invest in this area because of the kind of eye-popping numbers which are being shown as the appreciation of these assets. And it is important to kind of look at the entire landscape and then take a considered call. Now, and sometimes my views on this subject are a little unpopular, but I think always good to hear a contrarian perspective to make up your mind. So I feel that there are 4 different aspects of the crypto asset revolution, which is approaching us or which is already around us. which are to be kept in mind. And I will start with the philosophical one. And as we know, banking has always been an activity which is which has three different aspects to it, as classically it is known. It offers payment services. It offers the saving instruments so that people can save and they can buy and sell things. And then it also offers investment opportunities. So these are the three aspects of banking and the financial system, in fact. And the question about any new asset class is always what kind of economic purpose it is going to serve. And we all heard of the tulip mania, where the flowers were being valued very high. And some of the crypto assets definitely give that impression. So there is a philosophical question as to how will this asset be sustained and how will it be sustained in terms of the returns it will give to the investor. So that is number one question we have to consider. The other part is that it is still a very unregulated or very thinly regulated area. And financial system, as we know, is a very tightly regulated sector for good reasons, as we have seen various events in the past, most notably the 2008 global crisis. Regulation is a necessary ingredient of how financial system works. And in this area in particular, there is a lot of lack of clarity. Most regulators are studying it. Some regulators have gone ahead and put some regulations. And as we know, regulation always lags technological developments. And as an investor, this is important to consider because the regulation provides the safety net that investors require. And I think I was going through the UAE regulators' guidance on this. And I was very happy to see that the distinction between those who can invest and those who should not has been very clearly made. And there are, of course, institutional investors who have the right risk assessment capabilities in-house who can go ahead, but even they have to have assets which are more than AED 75 million or have a net annual revenue of 150 million or a paid-up capital of minimum 87 million. So I think this is a very prudent way of looking at things. For individuals who hold funds of 4 million or who have annual income of not less than 1 million are the ones who can invest. So this is one way of looking at things. And if you look at some other regulators, and all regulators are probably learning from each other, the Monetary Authority in Singapore has looked at crypto assets, classifying them as primarily payment instruments and then digital tokens. And they have put in place certain regulation. The currency kind of assets have to be dealt with by the dealers who have been registered under the Payment Act. And they have the usual requirement of customer due diligence, transaction monitoring, and suspicious transaction reporting. So this is one approach, but in many jurisdictions, these regulation is still to be put in place. So that is a factor for investors to keep in mind that when they invest, they should be aware of the regulatory protection available or regulatory guidance which is there. The other interesting part, and which sometimes goes back to the philosophical aspect, is that the original crypto asset, that is Bitcoin, is actually designed to evade regulatory oversight. And it is, of course, somebody's view of, as people say, a reaction to the global crisis when many people felt that regulators didn't do their job well, etc. And then this asset was created, which was designed to operate on its own. And it's a great technological innovation. But I don't know how these kind of assets will get regulated finally, because they are designed to operate under the radar and so on. That's important to keep in mind. The third point for investors to keep in mind is the prudence part of it, prudential part of it. If you look at the Bitcoin prices, I was just looking at a Bitcoin related tweet, and it says on Thanksgiving Day in the US, the Bitcoin prices were in 2013, $832. Then they dropped to $365 next year and remained there for some time. And last year they were $18,000. One Bitcoin was selling for $18,000. 2020 and 2021 it is at $58,000. So if you look at the volatility of the asset, and of course it is appreciating, so that understanding that it will go up or the further go up is very much there, and the Bitcoin's limited supply also makes it think so. But what goes up can come down, and that is what for investor is important to keep in mind. that they need to look at this factor. There are also more than 2,000 coins out there in the market, and which coin to choose, what differentiation it offers, what is the way they will grow, all is something which needs to be studied by the people who are going to buy these coins. The last point, and as a security professional, I think this is very important at the individual level, is to understand the risks of these coins not being secured properly. So there have been so many cases where people have simply forgotten the pins and their coins have been lost. There have been many cases where they have given away the password to a Trojan or a social engineering call. And there have been cases where the exchanges themselves have been hacked. So Mt. Gox is a major case on that. So because computer security is a complex problem and not easy to solve, of course, there are some basic precautions to be taken. Don't go to all kinds of sites, don't download unknown software and so on. The good practice in this area is, of course, to use a hardware token, and there are offline tokens. So in wallets, there are two kinds of wallets, hot wallets and cold wallets. Hot wallets are connected to the internet and more exposed to risk, and cold wallets don't connect to that. And hardware tokens like the one sold by Ledger and Nano and those kind of things are very useful. I mean, very well-designed security, I would say. And so that is something which, if there is a serious investor, he or she must look at the security of these wallets. So this is a long answer to, I think, a short question, but I hope I covered some of the relevant points.
Thank you. And since you started speaking, more and more questions are coming because this is there's a huge interest in this topic. And we'll come back to you with more questions on this topic, but I would remind everyone there is a Q&A session. Please try to have most of your questions on the Q&A sessions, please. Going away from cryptocurrency for a bit and back to Vinay. It's something Charanjit had touched on, which is that the sharing of information between financial institutions. So with the limitation in data sharing between financial institutions in relation to the fraud attack vectors, typologies, or fraudsters' details. What do you think is the starting point? And to be fair, I think Charanjit highlighted a bit on this, that as a UBF perspective, they're trying to work with the central bank, but I would like to hear your views and where do you think this should be going?
Yeah, sure. I mean, see, in UAE, yes, I mean, we've been working with the central bank, to enable data sharing among the banks. So it's very important, right? Because today what's happening is, one bank detects a fraud, right? You prevent it, you report it to the law enforcement, you report it to the regulators. But what's happening is this data has not been shared. It's all in silos, right? So unless you share the data among banks, right, at the speed at which you can, prevent fraud, we will slow down, right? Unless you share, you will be able to prevent at a much faster rate than ever. Now, the thing is that how do we enable this, within certain countries or markets for data sharing to happen, right? So the first thing is to develop a framework, right? And my view is that, and that's where the industry, the regulators, and the law enforcement should come together to develop a framework under which the data sharing should be, because it's very important, the framework, right? So what data should be shared, because I mean, obviously there are privacy laws as well, and when a specific data is being shared, right? One is, what are the criteria for that, right? So banks have to make sure that they take proper investigation, right? You're 100% sure that yes, I mean, the person or the data what you're reporting is actually a fraud, right? So you cannot have just a suspect or like a false positive cases, right? Because what would happen is somebody else would take an action based on the information which you have shared, right? So banks who actually share this data, they have to take the ownership of that, right? So the framework is very, very important. Second is the change in the regulation itself, right? So the regulation actually enabling the banks to be able to share the data. So that's very important, because in many jurisdictions across the globe, right, there are restrictions for banks to share data among other banks, right? So that change in the law is required, right? And the third piece is to have a platform. So once once you I would say sort out all these things, and you are ready to actually embark on this journey to share the data, you actually need to have a platform through which this data can be shared, because as we are going more and more digital, your system should be able to connect through an API to these this database, and should be able to retrieve data, share the data, and run. So that's my thoughts around
I agree, and we're all rooting for you from a UBF perspective, really, to make this happen, because it would make our life easier in protecting our customers in this domain. Sheetal, so though it sounds a bit technical question, but I'm not looking at a technical aspect. I'm looking from your experience as a compliance officer in relates of all the new technologies that the fraudsters are using, things like bot attack tools that we know that they call it as off the shelf. So it's available and it's available widely, unfortunately, and it's easy to use. At the same time, we're hearing about of spoofing. So there are lots of new tools and very sophisticated tools that fraudsters are using in order to take over customers' account through different channels, and especially digital channels. So what's your consideration of enhancement financial institutions can make to the control environment? And I said it's not technical. I think it's from a compliance officer perspective.
Sure. So this is something, in fact, we were discussing offline as well, Nisreen. So this is something which we have seen a surge, and yeah, quite, there are a lot of departments which works alongside, whether it's your information security, cybersecurity team, your data protection team, or in fact your fraud and your compliance team. We all are working together in that, and this is one of the big threats. So you are right. There is an ease in creating bot attack tools. Before anything else, it's important.
Sir, if I will stop you, but there is an echo in your voice.
Just a moment. Let me just see. Can you hear me now better?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, so maybe some speaker issues. Sorry about that. So yeah, before anything else, it's important first to establish the definition of a bots, because we all are talking about bots. Sounds cool, but we need to understand the definition of a bots or the internet bots, so that we are on the same page before discussing what we can do to stop these bot attacks. An internet bot is a software application or a program that runs automated scripts or tasks over the internet. Typically, they are executing relatively repetitive but straightforward tasks at a much faster rate than a human ever could. Bots are also known as internet robots, spiders, crawlers, or the web bots. These are the programs designed to perform repetitive jobs. Good ones can index a search engines. Bad ones, however, will infect your computer and set back the gathered data such as password, logged keystrokes, or the captured packets. I'll give you an example. A human might take 30-40 seconds to fill a form before submitting it, but a bot programmed exclusively for this can perform the same task at much faster rate, or even could be done instantly. So it is important to note that although bots or the internet bots now have a bad reputation due to their association with various cybersecurity threats, there are good bots owned by reputable companies like Google or Facebook. Bot traffics can account for more than half of their overall website traffic for many financial institutions, covering both good bots engaged in the essential business task or bad bots performing malicious activities. As I mentioned, I immigrated to New Zealand last year, and in New Zealand also there is a requirement to do your managed isolation quarantine. So it's not been managed manually. They are using good bots. So you stand in the queue and you use that. So just an example, there are good bots which actually automate your processes. So how do we know that there is a bot attack on a financial institution? Couple of examples, not an exhaustive list. You will see high number of failed login attempts. There will be increased chargeback and the transaction disputes. Consecutive login attempts with different credentials from the same HTTP client. Unusual activity for selected application content and data. There will be unexpected changes in the website or mobile app performance, and there will be a sudden increase in the account creation rate. let me talk about the most common bad bot attack. You would see it in the credit card fraud. There will be something called as ATO, which is account takeover attack, and there is something called as scrap content, which is done on the financial services websites. So let me give you a little bit just of a credit card fraud. What happened there is a bad bot leveraging credit card fraud technique, most commonly used by the hackers, is called as card cracking. Cracking is based on the idea that it's easy to obtain a credit card number, known as private account numbers, which we also say as PAN, together with the name printed on the card. Attackers use bots to guess and confirm the additional information required to crack and illegally use a credit card. There are several ways criminal can obtain your PANs. Buying a list of PANs, which is there on the dark webs, which you leave while doing your online shopping or whatever. Through people working in the retail or the restaurants who are exposed to your credit card information. Adding a device to a credit card swiper that enable unauthorized party to read the card information and the PIN. It is also called as skimming. And by phishing scams, in which typically somebody will call the owner and pretend to be an authorized party requesting their credit card details. On a large scale operation, a typical attacker would obtain a list of PANs and set up a bot that can attempt small purchases on a large list of payment site. The bot should attempt a purchase on a website, submitting credit card information for a PAN, and each time guessing a different combination of CVV, expiration date, and the postal code. How can we limit it? Yeah, so what we can do is we can include device fingerprinting, browse validation, machine learning of the behavior analysis, progressive challenges, two-factor, multi-factor authentication, API security. So these are a couple of ways you can prevent it, but as we know in our industry, you can mitigate, you cannot completely eliminate. And I'll also give you a gist of account takeover attacks. So what happened here is, this attack is also called as credential stuffing. It is a method in which attackers use the list of compromised user credential to breach a system. The attack uses bot for automation and scale and is based on the assumption that many people reuse usernames and password across multiple services. And I'll be very honest here, I'm a lazy person. The same user ID and mostly same password I used to do. And my phone was compromised. And there are a lot of things which has happened through my phone. And this could be either unawareness, could be just the lazy nature of yours that you need to remember so many passwords and all, but yes, your devices can get compromised. The statistics shows that around 1%, not even 1%, 0.1% of the breached credential attempted on another device will result in a successful login. So in addition to the device fingerprinting, multi-factor authentication, we can also use IP blacklisting here. A small gist of what is content scrapping, which is also something which the organization is seeing as a big threat. It's a process in which bots do extract content and the data of your website. Web scrapping extracts underlying HTML code and with it data stored in the database. The scrapper can then replace and replicate the entire web content somewhere else. So in my opinion, an organization prevention strategies should include subscription to cyber intelligence service, invest in an advanced anti-bot mitigation services, limiting the number of login attempts, stops the use of bot-driven brute force password cracking. Very importantly, in addition to training employees on smart password practices, financial institution can mandate strict password complexity requirement while using tools that make it easier for employees and the customers to manage and update passwords. It's not limited there. There is a requirement which goes, and it is important for you to understand well beyond password. It requires an ongoing employee training and compliance testing across the organization, which for me is very important. At a most basic level, firewall rules can be changed to block the IP addresses. In-app and in-platform security controls can help financial institutions to reduce the risk of credential thefts. Deploying anti-bot such as CAPTCHA and controls in the public-facing services can limit risk. Those controls include anti-session hijacking, secure key generation, and end-to-end encryption might help. Two-factor authentication on login for all public-facing services is also crucial. Financial services can consider out-of-band two-factor authentication, which sends the authentication request through a separate communication channel rather than relying solely on the SMSs. So you can use tokens, you can use Google. So there are ways, And finally, financial institution can regularly employ anti-money laundering activities and strictly enforce document authenticity verification to prevent forged documents from being used to open drop accounts. That's all from my side.
Thanks, Sheetal. And again, very comprehensive. And yes, it's an evolving world, and every day we're learning new term and a new technology as well. Mr. Nand, as I said, there are multiple questions coming to your side. One, I have to ask from Anonymous. Do you do cryptocurrency yourself?
So the short answer is no, but let me elaborate a little. So, having understood or studied the background of the original cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, the understanding that I have, having spent long time in the government, is that a sovereign function like currency issuance is not going to be relinquished by the government at a near future, and anything which is trying to play on that is not going to succeed. That was the original approach. And my son is an investor in Bitcoin, was in university, he also kind of got out of it. And we have had long discussions and sometimes arguments about, what is the benefit, or, what are the use cases for Bitcoin and so on. But I think the important part, especially for Bitcoin, is the environmental footprint or the energy footprint that it has. So for me, I think it's personally, I feel that that's a very important issue, and that is something where Bitcoin really doesn't work. Other cryptocurrency, I'm not really much read about. Of course, the Ethereum platform is a very different one, and it has different use cases also, and it is capable of doing smart contracts and various other things which are of interest to enterprises and individuals. That is something which would be interesting, but probably it is something to do with my wage, but I never invested into any of the cryptocurrencies.
Thank you. To go a bit more like deeper on this topic, if you don't mind. So, what's your view and risk consideration for financial institutions partnering and acquiring merchants involved in cryptocurrency sales offering? And what's your recommendation for risk strategy for such type of transactions, which would answer some of the questions as well that I've seen in the chat as well, and related to how do we deal with cryptocurrency fraud and so on.
Right. So as I said earlier, the state of regulation is very important to keep in mind for, of course, banks which are regulated entities. They have to go by the regulatory guidance on this. And in India, we have seen that the banks were asked not to provide banking services, and that was challenged in the court of law, and then it got settled in favor of those who were challenging it. And the other part of it is the regulation of the exchanges themselves, which is the other aspect of the how stable the merchants are, and how what is their financial wherewithal and those kind of things. I think those usual merchant acquisition factors will apply. I was going through the FATF literature on cryptocurrency, and they have put out very good guidance around treating virtual assets, as they call them, as on par with other financial instruments, and to extend regulation to those, and especially to ensure that the money laundering risk is taken care of. And various jurisdictions are kind of working on it. Some are, it's still, as I said, is work in progress. But the risk of money laundering for, especially for peer-to-peer transactions in cryptocurrency, is flagged as a high risk. Now, peer-to-peer transactions are where the exchange is not involved, and the wallets are able to bypass the exchange mechanism. These are called unhosted wallets. And so the FATF actually commissioned a few specialist companies to estimate the amount of peer-to-peer transaction in the whole ecosystem. And the numbers are very wide, so probably they don't help much. But they are ranging from 13% to almost 80% plus kind of thing. So peer-to-peer transactions, if they become popular, especially with a currency which is designed to evade provide anonymity, as the users will call it, then it becomes a money laundering issue, which will be of interest to the banks per se when they are providing the banking service and payment services to these transactions at the origination point. I think there is a move in the US where the regulator is looking at allowing banks to provide digital asset custody services. That's an interesting area to look at because of the nature of the asset and the technology around it. So that is where I think banks may have to study it and then see whether they can go into that and what kind of capabilities they will require. And the other area I wanted to touch upon was that of stable coins. Now, stable coins are coins which are completely backed up by real world assets, and typically $1 to 1 coin kind of ratio is supposed to be maintained. And stable coins may have some good use cases. For example, when Facebook came out with their Libra coin, and they backed it up with the capital to make it work. The reach of Facebook across the world and the kind of financial inclusion possibilities which were there in that kind of a coin being allowed were very interesting. So I think if that comes about, then that is another area which banks may want to look at. But as of now, I think, as I said, the area looks to me, at least from my limited understanding, a little uncertain, and it would be important to watch the regulation. Of course, the usual security considerations that I mentioned earlier are important to keep in mind. The due diligence is important to keep in mind. Transaction monitoring is important to keep in mind, and then reporting as it happens of suspicious transactions. So I would think these would be the key considerations, and how they operate would depend on each bank's own procedures and systems, and that's how they may have to look at it.
And maybe you can just answer this very short, if you don't mind, and we'll get away totally from the cryptocurrency topic. It's the last one is, do you think, are there any central bank government going to come up with their cryptocurrency soon?
Yes, this is something probably I should have mentioned already. So the central bank digital currency is a hot topic in central banking space. And I think all banks are looking at it. Some banks have already done pilots, notably the People's Bank of China has done a pilot where they created wallets of CBDC, and they are evaluating the experience. I think the Swedish bank, central bank, has already been working on this. And this is a very interesting area because it kind of leverages the interest in electronic payments which is already there, and then tries to see if the central banks can kind of get into it. I was reading a recent article about the Canadian banks thinking on this, and the consensus there, I mean, the author's view was that where electronic payments are pervasive already, the central bank digital currency offers no additional advantages. In fact, because of the disintermediation that will happen, because the deposits may move to the central bank directly, it may actually affect the banking sector itself, which has financial stability implications. So I think it is far from being settled that central bank digital currency is a unmitigated boon, and that will need to be studied, and the understanding of how it operates, the privacy implications of such a system being built also have to be studied. So this will need to be watched, but it is going to pose a challenge to the cryptocurrency because it is unlikely to be based on the digital ledger technology, but it will kind of take the wind out of the sails of many of the cryptocurrencies.
Yes, I totally agree. So Vinay, to go back to some of the questions which had been asked by our attendees, and please feel free, everyone, to put your questions in the Q&A session. So Vinay, the question is, I would like to know how you are going to balance between proper controls and flexibility of using digital platform, especially there is old generation that needs a simple way to perform banking transactions.
Yeah, so as I actually mentioned earlier, right? So for the customer, the experience always has to be seamless, right? Whether it's the older generation or or you're talking about the millennials or somebody in the middle age group, right? So as a customer, your experience should be seamless. It should be effortless, right? What you need to create is a trusted, what you call digital persona of your customer, right? So when that changes is when actually you interject and probably step up the authentication, right? So today, what banks or majority of the banks do is everything is OTP based. It's very complex, right? So for the customer at the front end, it should be very seamless. If I want to apply for a product or for a service, it should be very simple, because what you're doing is you've already created a digital trusted persona of your customer. So like, yes, this is the customer's device, this is where the customer logs in from, this is the location. So once you have that digital what you call trusted digital profile of your customer, right, then you don't need to actually every time make it very complex for the customer to apply for a product. So that's where you have to balance your customer experience and your fraud prevention strategies, right? So the thing is, I would say that when you actually implement your fraud prevention strategies, you have to also think from a customer experience perspective, and that will only happen with continuous dialogue with your business partners, and to make sure that how this experience can be seamless.
I agree, and it's always about the balance, and it's catering for our customers' needs. And yes, thanks, Vinay. Sheetal, this question is not. Yeah, you want to say something else, Vinay? Sorry.
So I just wanted to give an example of Amazon, right? So today, like when you go and shop at Amazon and when you use your credit card, right? Amazon doesn't ask for any additional details from you, right? Because, like for example, you as a cardholder, your bank may be 3D secure, right? And Amazon as a merchant and the acquiring bank also may be 3D secure, but they don't invoke the 3D secure, right? So you don't have to input your OTP and so on. Now, how that happens is Amazon uses massive data, right, to profile the customers. So they know that yes, I mean it is Nisreen who is actually shopping. So they don't want to step up the audience. They actually want you to actually purchase more products, right, and check out. So I mean from a banking perspective also, what banks want is they want the customers to transact, apply for products and services. And I think that's how they approach it. So what happens in your background, right, is not something which should interject with the customer's experience.
Yes, thanks, Vinay. And we're all moving into this direction of digital. So as I said, the more easier transactions can be, it's easier for the customer's perspective. It's just the responsibility that we have towards our customers. I think it's what's important to keep in mind. Sheetal, this question is not really related to the topic that we have been discussing all along, but if you don't mind to answer it from the Q&A session. Why compliance is given more light than fraud prevention? Should they be working together ideally? Because maybe I called you as a compliance officer, not as a fraud prevention person. So putting both hats on, how would you answer this question?
So I believe I'm not on mute this time. Okay, yeah, so I'm not talking to myself. Okay, so see, I'll give you an example. When we started doing compliance was always like a good to have function. It was never been a must to have function. And as the industry evolved, we have understood the cost of being non-compliant. So when I entered in this industry, compliance was always being put into the legal department or maybe under the risk department. And even for that matter, if you talk about the Australia or New Zealand market, the risk and compliance is one unit even now. So, and if you see the switch which is happening in the UK or the Middle East, because we largely follow the UK model, we have a risk department, which is operational risk, and then we have a fraud department, and then we have a financial crime or a regulatory compliance department, which is segregated. But even if you move to smaller firms or boutique firm, you have a fraud officer who is also a risk officer, who is also a compliance officer, who is also multi-hatting your anti-money laundering activities. I do not see that one department is more important or the other department is less important. We all are doing our jobs respectively and everything is important. But compliance, if you look from the AML and regulatory perspective, it's more, aspects of the financial crime, including frauds. So even if you go for certain certification like ACFCS, they do include fraud. So I do not exclude fraud from a compliance officer hat. We all work interrelatedly, but yes, historically we related fraud only to the financial frauds. Now the importance of the frauds have different shapes and form and being understood now and have been given more importance. But if you see, the compliance has wider impact on the communities we live in and globally. So things like terrorist financing or the drugs or the child abuse or the labor, these are more harmful than frauds. And compliance do have the regulatory requirements. Fraud is more internal to the organization. So non-compliance do have the critical replication, fines and sanctions, which has a wider reputational damage. So I do not levise something over above. I think everything is important, but yes, I think compliance is more to do with your legislation, more to do with your requirement, and possibly that could be the reason that sometimes we do feel that it's a and obviously that these are the departments which do have the personal liability on a compliance officer. So most likely that could be the reason people do perceive it as, but I think both the department works hand in hand and both are equally important.
Yes, I agree. It's about I think it's been always hand in hand, and it's always been one team. We call it being part of fraud, being part of compliance, or being part of any other. Like each bank has their own different organization, and fraud sits in different areas. But with this time, I think fraud is becoming more and more on the top of everyone's agenda, and I don't think there is one department more important than the other. Okay, as we're going to our end of our session for today, I think we have one more question, and I'll ask the question, and if any of the panelists would like to answer it, please feel free. To be fair, there is one acronym that had been used that I'm not really sure what does it mean. So I'll open it for the panelists. If you know what they're talking about, then it's from Sagar Rajkumar. So I'll ask the question, and if Sagar, if you can just explain more what's the question. So the question says, in your view, we are sitting with over 50 FIs in the UAE. So I'm not sure what FI refers to. Is it required? Doesn't it open window to the population? Okay, financial institution, thanks. Okay, so let me ask the question again then. In your view, we're staying with over 50 financial institutions in the UAE. Is it required? Doesn't it open window to the population with criminal motives? Is the population matured here to AI? Okay, so this is another question. So let me ask the first question. Doesn't it open window to the population with criminal motives? Natkumar, are you comfortable to answer this question? To have lots of financial institutions, let me summarize it, to have lots of financial institutions, up to 50, in a country like UAE, do you think that it opens a window for bad actors? Is it linked?
So I don't know whether I'm qualified to answer this question, because I don't have enough understanding of the sector in the UAE. But this is a problem that we see in India also, and I will talk from that experience. In India, we have cooperative banks, we have non-banking financial companies, and we have scheduled commercial banks, and they are of various sizes. And last week, the McKinsey report on banking came out, and they talked about how the rockstar banks are doing 5 times better return on equity than the others or laggards. Now, this is a problem of the ecosystem where there are banks which have been in existence for decades. So they will be surviving. They will be using technology in some way. They will be falling prey to some frauds and so on. And so on and so forth. I think if you look at developed countries also, sometime like I was in Canada, and there are credit societies there which are like banks, and they have similar functions in their structures. So I don't think there is a single answer to this, how many should be there. It's a very prescriptive way of looking at things. I think as long as the market takes care of the efficiencies of the banks and their competitiveness, I think that should decide what size banks should exist and how many should be there. Banking, is, as we know, is a very trust-based business. And a small bank may offer that feeling of trust much better than a very large bank. Large banks have better technology, so they may offer more products, better customization, better mobile banking experience. The millennials are not looking at loyalty and trust as much as the user experience. So there are various factors at work, and I think the right way, to my mind, would be to leave it to the market to sort out those who are efficient and those who are not doing well. They will get acquired, or they may merge with other banks to become larger entities or whatever. But I don't believe that large banks only can serve the purpose. I think we need a diverse ecosystem which will serve all kinds of customers and customers.
Thanks. Vinay, last question, if you can squeeze it in the last 2 minutes that we have for this session. Do you believe that the population in this country here are mature enough for AI, artificial intelligence, and a digital economy?
See, I think so, right? So, I mean, if you look at the government services here, what we actually use is fully digitized, right? So people are digital savvy today, right? So today, if you want to apply for any government services, you don't actually go into an office or, go to a little office, right? So everything's digital. So people are already used to, the digital economy, right? Now, whether, the market is mature to use, AI technologies, I would say that already, a lot of institutions have actually invested in it, and that space is growing, right? And for you to actually adopt to a proper AI related technology, I think the main thing is data, right? So I think the space is evolving, and there's a lot of investments being done. And I think in the next couple of years we will see a massive change or shift in the industry.
Great, thanks.
Can I add?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think AI probably helps cater to even the least technologically literate people. Now look at the way natural language processing has evolved. There was a time when you could talk to Alexa only in English. Now it takes inputs from people in various languages. And that's a great customer experience because you don't have to know the back end of the technology. You have only the kind of various services which are being offered. And AI and ML make it possible to happen. So I think it is up to the service providers to use AI ML in a manner which then makes the customers experience really natural and very comfortable. And I think more technology will really help in that. As technology adoption improves, more services will come up, and chatbots and voice bots will really do this, what is expected of them. That's my view.
Thanks, and thanks for all your views on this session. This is the end of our session. I think we answered most of the questions. There's one last one which came, but our session is over. We'll try to take it offline. But thanks for the great panelists. I learned a lot in this session. And as I said, fraud is an evolving topic. We're all learning. I've been in this industry for 14 years, but there's something to learn every single day. So together, for better customer experience, safe customer experience as well to our customers. Thanks for the Iqtisad Al-Amal and the UBF for this opportunity from the four of us. And now I'll hand over it back to Ola or Walid. Thanks so much.
Thank you for this insightful panel. Coming up next, digital onboarding for a seamless and secure journey. The moderator of this panel is Mr. Charanjit Singh, Chairman of UAE Banks Federation Fraud Prevention Committee and a Senior VP, Head of Group Fraud Risk and Investigation at FAB. Mr. Charanjit.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you, Nisreen, Nankumar, Sheetal, and Vinay for a very interesting discussion on the topic. We'll move on to the second section for the day. I'll quickly talk about why we chose this topic in terms of digital onboarding. So we are seeing all around that digital is the key. In fact, in this session itself, the participant and panelists spoke about digital payments, digital currency, but one very important aspect of moving on a digital journey is to kickstart digital onboarding. Now, what do we mean by digital onboarding? We'll hear from our learned panelists and what are the risks and what are the mitigating controls we could implement whether digital journey is limited to customers or it can be extended beyond. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers for this particular panel. So we have Sujata Dasgupta. She is based in Sweden. She is Global Head of Financial Crime Compliance Advisory with Tata Consultancy Services. She has worked in 7 different financial hubs in the globe, including in US, UK, EU, and Asia. She has been named Risk Professional of the Year 2021 by Waters Technology. She is also the winner of Fraud Prevention Awards 2021 by Themis, and she has featured among the 10 young and inspiring businesswomen to watch in 2021 by Tycoon Success Magazine. We also have Ali Suhater. He is based in Hong Kong. Ali has overall work experience of 15 years in banking sector. He is presently working with Mox Bank, where he heads a digital enterprise risk management function. Mox Bank is a fully digital new generation bank. He has also architected and managed large-scale projects in various banking domains. And then we have our third panelist, Mr. Nick. Nick is based in, just 1 minute, friends. Yeah, Nick is Chief Identity Strategist at Open Identity Exchange. Nick has expert knowledge of identity and fraud solutions for a variety of different sectors using different verification techniques, spanning data validation to document selfie verification. Nick also led experience development, launch, and operation of a full identity as a service solution. It was the first live example of a digital ID that is seamlessly interoperable across public and private sector in the UK. Nick is based in UK. With that, we would move into the discussion on this particular piece. So let me ask Sujata. I'll go to Sujata first, and then I would request other panelists to chip in. Sujata, what do we mean by digital onboarding, and what are the drivers for it?
Sure. First of all, hello everyone. Hi Charanjit, and thank you for having me on this very distinguished forum. I'm really lucky to be among so many esteemed speakers in this conference today. So coming to the question, Charanjit, I'll break it up into 2 parts. First is talking about digital onboarding itself. And secondly, the drivers. So I know you touched upon it briefly during the introduction. So I'll break it up into 2 parts. So first of all, digital onboarding, what is it? So traditionally, we know onboarding for any financial services. There is a process, which is whether it's an individual or an entity, there are a set of processes. For example, it involves the identification and verification by means of matching certain documents, photographs, signatures. The process is meant to identify that the customer is who he says he is, so that we do not wrongfully onboard customers into a bank who may be criminals or who may be using stolen identity of other victims. So that is the process which is sort of a gatekeeper, so that we do not allow bad elements to enter the system. Now, traditionally, this onboarding was done mostly physically, where the customer, whether again individual or an entity, would have to visit a bank's branch and provide all the necessary documentation, signatures, photographs, and then the bank would go on doing this physical identification, verification process, checking all the documents, matching information provided, and then again go on with the remaining manual process, for example, entering the data in their onboarding systems, screening, risk profiling, and all of that. And finally, it comes to a decision-making process that if everything is fine, you accept the application of the customer to onboard or reject. Now, like I said, traditionally, this was more of a manual process. Now, this is growing to be a digital process. So what is this digitization then? By digitization, we mean that we are using some advanced technology solutions by which this entire process is getting more automated, more straight through, so that the human intervention is reduced to that extent. And most banks are still retaining the judgment-based, the decisioning, whether to approve or reject the customer. Many banks are still retaining it with the humans at the bank side. But from the initiation to that process where the approval is required, the entire process is getting automated. And again, the customer does not need to visit a bank branch. So it is through the application, through mobile apps, through web. It is all through multiple digital channels. And this is something which the customer can do from the comfort of his own home, or from, it's like anywhere you can onboard, you can initiate that onboarding from anywhere. All you have to do is the customer needs to provide this required documentation just by taking a picture of all of them on the camera installed as part of the phones or the web, the desktop applications. So it can be initiated anywhere by the customer who does not need to visit a branch physically. From that point on, technology enables the verification of the customer, the verification of the documents, doing the screening, matching with the identity document databases, doing several other background checks, while also running some fraud rules in the background of that application. So it's a combination of doing the identification, verification, as well as some background rules for checking that it is not actually some fraudster who has impersonated or who has stolen the identity. And then this process is generally a straight through. If everything goes fine, it's a straight through process. Only if there is a mismatch, or there is a gap in the data, or the documents and the information provided is not matching, only then it falls into an exception queue, so that there is a human analyst at the bank side who picks that up. So it's more of a straight through exception based process. Now, coming to the second part, what were the drivers of digital onboarding? So I think this digital onboarding started quite a few years ago, and I would say there were key drivers, both from the point of customer experience and from the point of the bank's own the compliance perspective. So from a customer perspective, definitely this has enhanced the enhancing the customer experience was one of the key drivers, because every time the customer need not have to go to a bank branch and provide all these documents physically. The customers could do this from the comfort of their own homes, and it has turned out to be quite a seamless experience. Over a period of time, we know that process has got through iteratively, it has become so much more seamless. The customer journey becomes more seamless. And of course, speed is much more, because earlier, where it used to take days, it is now taking minutes or maybe a couple of hours. For individuals, it just takes minutes. For entities, it takes maybe a couple of hours. So there has been a drastic reduction in terms of cycle time for onboarding. So what happens is the customers are able to get a new account much more quicker than what was happening, say, earlier. For corporates, it was taking close to a month. So that cycle time has reduced. So these were the two drivers for the customers. Now, from the bank's perspective, again, it was a huge reduction in manual effort. And when manual effort is reduced, of course, cost is also reduced. But this was there was no compromise here. So there was still a lot of this identification verification process happening by advanced technology solutions like AI and NLP and all those things that we were talking about. So this has not compromised on the identification parts. In fact, there is enhanced compliance, enhanced verification, because these solutions are now able to check whether whether a document is tampered or forged, or some stolen identity is being used. So there is a lot of check on the on the account opening fraud perspective, and it has also cut down on the cycle time. So for the banks, time to realize revenue from customers has also become shorter. So in terms of 1 month from when you could open an account and start earning fees, you could do it in, say, 1 or 2 days. So I think from the bank's perspective, it is speed, it is cost, it is enhanced compliance. And from the customer perspective, it was the customer experience and the turnaround. So I would say these were, in a nutshell, the key drivers.
Thank you, Sujata. Ali, let me come to you now with your experience of working in a new age bank. What is your take on digital onboarding, and what you would say from the banking perspective, like Sujata gave her perspective? What are the drivers?
So actually, from a banking perspective, the drivers have become honestly not to be thought of, because after all, we have to comply with these new ways of doing business. Otherwise, you are not on the business anymore. The entire competition is either from a either customers are driving this, or we are driving this because this requires less resources, right? And to be able to manage more quantities faster. Also, because from various aspects, digital onboarding is less prone to certain risks. So because of those three, actually, it's both the industry moving to this direction, and the customers, of course, are demanding these services, enhanced security and less resources to consume. So these are the major drivers, I believe.
Thanks, Ali. And Nick, that brings me to another point. In terms of digital onboarding, we heard both Sujata and Ali, what is digital onboarding, what are the drivers, but what are the key risks and how can we mitigate those risks?
Absolutely. So it's the move online, has very much been driven by, and there's colleagues here who have talked about the drivers from, say, banks to reduce cost was a big driver to start with, and then there's a big appetite for consumers to move online, but all of this comes with a fraud risk, and whilst we drive more things online, and undoubtedly the AIs and automated systems are better at spotting a fake document than a human is. So if you're sending somebody into a bank branch with a document and giving them to presenting those to a member of staff who's maybe has some training on what a good document looks like, but they're by no means expert. The AI expert systems now are much better at recognizing the documents themselves. So on one hand, we've mitigated fraud, but we're also, the anonymous channel is a brilliant channel for the fraudster. If you're a fraudster to go into a bank branch, puts yourself at huge risk of being caught and of being arrested. If you can do all of that remotely and you can get all the way through to opening an account with a minimal risk from a fraudster point of view, then it's a very attractive channel. So, and as we move towards digital identities and reusable identities, that problem compounds from a fraudster point of view. We shouldn't believe that by going digital, we are resolving the fraud problem. We are closing some doors, but we're opening others, and fraudsters will always find those new doors and prise them open and make the most of those gaps while they're there. So any system we put in place has got to be very quickly adaptable to new fraud threats to make sure those doors are closed.
Thanks, Nick. So that brings me to another topic in terms of using technology to mitigate this risk of fraud which come in. How can we use AI? Can we use it while doing digital onboarding and mitigating the risk?
Maybe I can maybe start on the use of AI, because that is the area which I work in as well. So while we heard about Nick talking about the problem of anonymity, because earlier there was this customer who was going to the bank branch and there was a physical person, but now I fully agree with him that with digitization and the digital identities being stolen with every data hack, and they are being sold on the dark web, so I'm sure all of our digital identities are there out would be with some fraudster out there. So it might be much more easier than me going physically to a bank branch and getting onboarded, in comparison to what the fraudsters could do it. But yes, I do believe, again, like Nick was mentioning, that while technology opens one door, there are again some doors through which they might enter. But to this topic about how some of these risks could be mitigated, about the synthetic frauds or the stolen identity related onboarding frauds, I think these are addressed to a great extent when we talk about the biometric and the selfie video based onboarding solutions which we are seeing, which have evolved over the past few years. So even in terms of biometric, digital onboarding using biometrics, earlier what was happening is through this solution, which could be installed on your mobile phone or your desktop, what would happen is all you would require is take a picture of yourself, use pictures of all the documents that you are asked to provide, And then the rest of the processes would be taken care of by the system itself. Now, again, taking an image of myself, this was again being spoofed by fraudsters. So they were using very high resolution images, stolen images of me, which were of very high resolution, and they were using that along with my stolen identities, and they were again going through the system because the images were so good in quality. The solution could not identify that it was actually just an image taken, and I was not taking my own picture. So to mitigate that, now we have these selfie videos, which actually checks the liveness of the customer. Liveness means if I am onboarding myself, I would have to do some movement. So the system would tell me whether I have to move my head to the left, right, blink, or speak out a few words which may be coming on the screen. So this is part of this whole facial recognition using deep neural networks, by which it's a 3D map of the face. It's not just 2D an image. It's a 3D map, which is while I move around, it's taking that image. Then while I'm speaking, there is this voice to text check. Also, whether my lip movement is matching with words spoken. So all these are part of the liveness check, which is again the whole dynamic biometrics. Now, if I go to the document verification part, so there may be stolen documents, but my originals are still with me, right? So what has been stolen could be just a digital copy or a photocopy or a photo taken from a screen. Now, these solutions are able to run forensic scans, texture analysis on the images of the documents provided on the app. And the solutions are able to identify whether the document which is provided is a tampered document or it's a forged document, or whether it is a photo of a photo or a photo taken from a screen. So all these can be identified by these AI solutions. Then through the OCR, the OCR will extract the data provided in that document, and this will be sent for identification to the database of where where this identification document was issued. For example, if my passport has been forged, so the OCR will extract the details from my passport and send it to the passport database for verification, and then match the two. So any mismatches will cause this whole process to fail. So I think there are all these, as we come across new challenges, the solutions are also getting more advanced in terms of adding more features, adding more security layers. Also, we were talking about, while there is an onboarding going on, there is a background, there are those fraud check rules going on. So there is, I might be onboarding myself as somebody from, say, an X country, whereas my geolocation shows something else, or my device shows it is registered with something else, because that data is available with the mobile network operators. So there is all those multiple fraud checks which are going on in the background as well while this customer is providing these details. So I think as we are facing new challenges, technology is also advancing in order to mitigate some of those risks, so that we do not, at least synthetic frauds or these stolen identity related fraud, somebody has just taken pictures of my documents. So I think a lot of these fraud related instances are being blocked by these advanced technology solutions.
Thank you, Sujata. So you raised one very important point about verifying with the source. Most of the time, people, when they look at digital, they rely on the fact that you are capturing data through NFC, or you are capturing data from the source document, and that is enough. But fraudsters, they advance. We saw some Q&A earlier that how come despite putting up so many resources, why fraud still happens? So to validate authenticity of any document or any information, the best source is the source of that information or document. Yeah. You cannot say that because we have scanned the original passport, that's why this information is accurate. Unless you verify the passport with the passport issuing authority, or in the case of UAE, the Emirates Identity Authority, you cannot say that this Emirates ID is genuine. Even if you use NFC, or even if you validate the images being taken from our original document. Thanks, Sujata. Ali, if I come to you in terms of risk and how do we mitigate with your experience, would you like to share some insights?
Sure. Actually, the foundations of this topic has been laid out very well by Nick and Sujata. So I would like to, I don't want to repeat, but pull attention to this artificial intelligence point particularly. So yes, artificial intelligence, or let's say biometrics in this context, is evolving, and controls against video attacks or liveness attacks are also being introduced. But at the same time, the attacks also evolve. So the problem is between the time for the banks or the institutions to come up to speed against certain types of attacks. There's a gap in between always. So the problem, not the problem, but the downside of artificial intelligence, it's after all mathematical calculation, and it's trying to imitate a human cognitive ability as identifying image recognition or identifying, telling people apart. So the problem with artificial intelligence is if it is not under constant monitoring, when they start to go wrong, they go wrong big time. So until you understand that the algorithms is failing, a lot of things may have already gone wrong. So a close attention to the accuracy and precision of the results of the algorithm has to be given. Otherwise, we call this the amplification risk in terms of artificial intelligence. For example, someone finds a threat vector, let's say to bypass liveness, showing a different type of a video to the camera. And this is a new type of a threat, let's say. So until it is found, the failure rate of the system is 100% whenever the same attack is done. So a constant oversight from a management accountability perspective has to be paid to such artificial intelligence solutions which are employed in these digital onboarding systems.
Yeah, and if I may add to, sorry, go ahead, Nick.
No, thank you. I was going to add that the flip side, what we've talked about so far is the application of AI and biometrics in terms of recognizing an individual as a positive, recognition that it's them. AI is also very good at recognizing that this is not the person who we think it should be. So there's a whole sector of behavioral biometrics, which should be used alongside the kind of positive biometrics of face matching. So that once someone's already within the system and we're expecting the same person to return, we expect them to behave in the same way. So looking at the way, if they're using a tablet or a mobile, the way they touch the screen, if they're using a keyboard, the cadence on the keyboard will be consistent for an individual. And where AI is very good is at spotting those subtle differences between the normal person's behavior and the behavior that is now a fraudster trying to impersonate the normal person. And that's both on behavioral biometrics and general pattern matching in terms of fraud. So we've got kind of different layers of AI here. We've got the kind of positive use of it to recognize an individual, and then the negative use of it to recognize the fraudster. And those two things that need to be used in tandem in all cases to try and spot the fraudster.
So I was going to add that, like we've all been discussing, that AI can be used in both ways. It is an advanced technology. So while banks are using it to defend themselves, criminals are also using it to outsmart banks themselves. So in the context of this whole how AI is enabling advanced dynamic biometrics, I got reminded of the deep fakes, which I read, I think about a couple of months ago, where the deep fake videos are able to impersonate people so well, because this is being used now in Hollywood for bringing back the old actors and creating their videos, and it is so similar to the real life actors themselves. So now I'm sure this will be picked up by criminals and used in so many ways. So possibly this could also be one of the challenges now, that as technology advances, for example, the deepfake videos where we were talking about the selfie video based onboarding. As of now, it's okay, but then there are deepfake videos, then our AI solutions will have to get more advanced in order to identify whether it is a genuine video or a deepfake video. So that challenge continues.
There's a video on YouTube of Barack Obama deepfake. I attended one of the webinars the other day, and they were showing that nobody could make out that it's a deepfake.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sujata, Nick, and Ali. So now we are talking about onboarding. We are talking about using AI to ensure that onboarding is secured. But that brings up another question. And again, open to all of you, Sujata, Nick, and Ali. Can we say that if onboarding is done in a secured manner, you can remove all other controls? Or you think there is still a case to have other controls in place while you do a secure onboarding? So to give a scenario, you do digital onboarding and then payments are taking place. Do you need to have some controls in place to watch out for a third party initiating fraudulent payments, or to look out for payments initiated by customer himself but under the influence of social engineering?
So actually, sorry, I took it. So actually, Nick already mentioned some of it, and Sujata as well. But a layered approach is required, of course, in risk management, especially in this sort of onboarding procedures. So we should never say that we are 100% sure that there is no impersonation here. One, of course, there is natural error rate of whatever systems we use because they are stochastic systems. They are not deterministic. So maybe 1/1,000,000 times, maybe 1/10,000 times. But there's an inherent machine error rate. So that's number one. So we do not totally rely, 100% rely on one control. Let's say biometric is okay, everything is okay. So there should be a layered approach. Nick gave a good example. Also, behavioral biometry may be added on top of it. So it is very hard to impersonate both with face biometry and also with behavioral biometry, both at the same time. And also on top of that, the relevant scores, for example, of that biometric verification could be used for future tracking customers' transactions. May there be risky transactions, additional precautions could be applied to. So there are various fraud surveillance controls that could be used, but definitely it's not like one shop, one stop, and everything is done. So there should always be a layered approach depending on the infra.
Yeah, so when it comes to fraud, there is no silver bullet. You need to have a mix of controls and layered controls, as Nick, Sujata, and you mentioned earlier. Thanks.
If I could perhaps add to that, you've got, we haven't got a purely digital, 100% digital channel. No one's got that at the moment. So we're going to have other channels. We're going to have telephony, and we're going to have, and we've got various flavors of digital channel. So we've got digital, which is me using my tablet or my phone. We've got me chatting to a bot, which is also a digital channel as well. And the fraudsters are going to go work all of those different channels and find the vulnerabilities. And the chat channel is very interesting because where they are AI based as well, fraudsters are working out how to fool the AI to get through chat questions, to get the bot to respond in the right way to get them what they want. But then if it's a direct telephony channel where you're talking to an individual, the fraudster's charm is still there. And that's where, they're tricksters, they're scam artists, and they will still use their own vulnerabilities or their own desperation to convince agents to help them and maybe bend the procedures to get through. So whilst we've still got those other channels, it's not purely digital. We've got to have fraud defenses in all those different channels. We've got a Open Identity Exchange. We've got a fraud controls guide that really emphasizes that it's yes, focus on the digital front door, then the digital log on of the individual afterwards, but don't forget your other channels around that, because that's where the fraudsters will get in.
Yeah, I totally agree. So when we are talking about digital onboarding is the prevention part. So today we may be onboarding a genuine customer, but tomorrow there could be two cases. One is the genuine customer may have gone rogue, like what we see in the case of say synthetic identities, or there may be a set of transactions which they do to prove that they are genuine, and then one day like in credit card frauds, we have seen that they will do genuine card transactions, they will make the payments, and then one day they will max it out with no intention of paying back. So we have seen, the customers we onboarded as genuine, they turn rogue later on. That is one scenario. The other is there is this genuine customer, but his credentials, his devices, his instruments may have been stolen by somebody else, and somebody else is actually doing these transactions. So while digital onboarding is good to have, to allow only good customers inside your bank, then a continuous monitoring, for example, your payment monitoring is equally essential, just to establish that it is the same customer who is doing this transaction, and the customer is actually doing a legitimate transaction. So it has to be, again, these multiple layers, as we talk about the digital persona of a customer. It combines the geolocation, the network, the devices, the instruments. For example, if you're using a card or a token, the phone number, the multi-factor authentication, for example, if it's your OTP, if it's your biometrics. So I think all of these in totality is combined to form the various layers of the identification, whether there is a threat, there is a risk, whether it is somebody is spoofing the network itself, because somebody may have stolen my phone and they may be using it from somewhere else. Then the fraud detection tool should be able to identify that it is not matching with my digital persona. I do not generally use those kind of networks or those kind of locations. So it should go as a red flag and not directly approve the transaction. So yes, all these are multi-layered threat risk mitigation approaches, and it should not the fraud risk the fraud defense should not come at the point of say execution. It should start at the point of initiation itself, when when the a payment or a transaction is initiated. That is when the geolocation, the network, the device, the instrument, all that, the cumulative information comes to the next layer from the previous layer, so that when it comes to the final execution, the decision is already made whether this is a legitimate or a fraudulent one. So I think that layered approach makes it much more robust.
Thanks, Sujata. That reminds me of a scenario wherein a check is fraudulently encashed. The trigger for that would be how the request for checkbook was placed, whether there was an address change which preceded the checkbook placement request, whether there was a mobile number change request around that time. So the incident of fraud, which is a fraudulent check encashment, that was preceded by a lot of other trigger events, which if one had good insight about these data points and could relate to customers' normal behavior, one could have prevented that kind of fraud. Thank you. Now that brings me to another question on our agenda, which is, can we say that digital onboarding is only for customers, or can we look at expanding the digital onboarding to other stakeholders in the banking ecosystem, or for that matter, any organizational ecosystem? For example, can it be extended to staff? Can it be extended to vendors? Can it be extended to contractors? What are your views?
I'm happy to pick up in the first instance. So there's quite a few projects going on at the moment that are looking at staff onboarding and enabling staff to move, to rapidly engage with new employers. There's a project in Germany involving pilots with Lufthansa. There's been a project with the NHS in the UK looking at medical staff and their training and qualifications. And the objectives of both are the same: is to enable someone in an industry where people frequently move from one employer to another, often on a contract basis, for them to be instantly onboarded and for their qualifications, credentials, capabilities to be communicated digitally. So not just who they are, but also what they are capable and certified to do. And those are all pilot projects at the moment, but are cutting down massively the onboarding time for individuals as they go from one place to another. And you can imagine that the one in health was born out of pandemic needs to move staff around very quickly to respond to not just incidences of the pandemic itself, but the knock-on effects it then had in other healthcare, where in certain regions everything was thrown at COVID, and therefore other types of health had to be moved to other regions, other hospitals. So how do we onboard someone into a new hospital when we've moved all the cancer treatment over here? from over here, where we're now focusing on a COVID outbreak. So again, a lot of these changes have been driven by the pandemic, but there's two examples there where vendor onboarding, employee onboarding, and contractor onboarding is being tackled digitally.
So maybe I'll add on to that. I completely agree with what Nick mentioned, and even in the banking world, we are we are witnessing this whole change in the KYC phenomenon itself. So the term KYC is now moving on to KYX. X being any alphabet you put in, and that becomes your onboarding requirement. So it could be know your customer, know your employees, know your vendor, know your supplier, know your partner, contractors, everybody. So the mandate today is that anybody who is in your stakeholder list, who is involved with banking functions in any manner, should be there should be this whole onboarding process. And because this digital onboarding process is proving to be very successful in terms of the speed, the cost, reduced manual intervention, reduced turnaround time with customers, because this has been going on mostly with customers. And for any financial institution, customers form the bigger bulk of stakeholders. So an average bank may have, say, 5 to 10 million customers, whereas your employees would be much lower in terms of scale. But if it is being successful with customers, then the same can also be the same mechanism can also be deployed with screening and onboarding your other stakeholders. So I am a firm believer that digital onboarding should be used for enhancing this whole onboarding compliance process for other stakeholders as well.
Thank you, Sujata. Ali, you want to chip in?
Actually, I agree with my colleagues here, but I would like to draw attention to the scalability side of it. So, of course, usage of such procedures need to be justified with some scale. So companies with lots of employees or lots of vendors to manage, especially companies working with each other from different geographies, they definitely require such procedures for staff onboarding or vendor onboarding as well. Wherever there is an identity verification required, so these apply depending on the scale of it. Of course, you wouldn't do it for 100 onboarding 100 people to a bank, right? So the artificial intelligence cost of it would not work. But this is very much applicable to lots of industries across the world. I agree with my colleagues.
Thank you, Ali. We have a question here. We are nearing the closer time. We have 10 more minutes. So I would quickly move on to the Q&A and then we'll summarize the session. So Sujata, Nick, maybe if you want to answer this, I'll leave it to you, Ali. So the question is, can a collusion be mitigated in digital world? A tech-savvy criminal joins hands with a tech team employee to defraud an organization. There are other points, but I think this particular question, answer to this question would cover other points as well.
I can start on this one. So I think our audience wants to hear about, if there is a fraud where an employee is in collusion with, say, an outsider. Well, this is a classic case of, an employee fraud or an insider fraud, because if we see most of the bank frauds, I mean, till a recent report, I think I read about a year ago, that before this whole, this digital identity and cybercrime related frauds became the highest, highest chart topper, so to say. Before that, in terms of banking frauds, close to 70% of bank frauds were committed by insiders, by employees, either directly by themselves or in collusion with third parties. Now, in most cases, like what I have seen in my role as the global fraud and fin crime prevention, what I have seen is most banks do not have a system of monitoring their employees. Well, we were all talking about monitoring customers or third parties who may commit fraud through a bank, but there are no, in most cases, like I said, in most cases, I have not seen a mechanism where employees are being monitored to check whether behavior is anything close to a fraud. So those mechanisms are still not there. But in the last 1 year, I have seen an overwhelming requirement from banks where they are talking. So now this subject is not a taboo anymore. They are talking about, employing monitoring tools, and nothing better than employing, machine learning, AI, all these digital solutions. And the reason for using these digital solutions is that employees have access to all sorts of your physical assets, your digital assets. You talk about your SharePoints, your documents repository, which are all again digital in any bank nowadays. So employees will have access to all of these, in addition to your customer data, account data, your internal reports, your internal rules. So you also know what rules are being deployed in your detection engine. So employees know everything about what is going on in the bank. So they have access to huge amounts of data. Now, how does a bank then determine that which employee is doing probably doing a fraudulent behavior? So for that, I think AI is the best way to use in order to monitor employee behavior. Just to give a very simple example, an employee may be working in a particular department. He may have access to a particular set of accounts, but he's not having access to another set of accounts. For example, he may not have access to suspense accounts or some internal fees and commission accounts. But it is noticed that on a particular occasion, this employee is given access to some of these accounts and then quickly revoked as well. So this is just sort of a one trigger. Then working hours. What are the normal working hours for the peer group, and whether an employee has digressed from that kind of behavior in terms of working hours, in terms of leaves, or if somebody has logged in during the leave period, or if somebody has accessed some physical area which that person is not supposed to use. So the employee leaves a lot of footprint throughout accounts, which are the digital assets, I would say, and through the premises, which is the physical asset. So a combination of all this matching with what would be a normal employee behavior is what can give you the anomaly behavior. And that is what I think banks should be using now in terms of detecting anomalous employee behavior. Find out if they are if they are in the process of committing some fraud in the bank.
Thanks, Sujata. Nick, Ali, you want to add anything?
Ali, go on.
Okay, all right. So thanks, Nick. Actually, totally agreeing with Sujata. But on top of that, there are architectural approaches to this as well, combined with Sujata's points. For example, there is this concept of zero trust. So it's both a technical concept, but also a non-technical concept around people, not only around systems. So that basically means we don't differentiate between an internal user or an external user. Whatever the situation is, they have to go through this similar authorization logics. So, and then they would be granted with the relevant tokens, and they could only access that relevant data. So they would be treated as also internal actors would be treated as external actors. So this is a very broad subject, but there are also architectural approaches, organizational approaches on top of surveillance. So these are being employed recently.
Thanks, Ali. Nick?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I was going to make that is that, if you look at, there's quite a famous fraudster called Elliot Castro. He has a book. I don't wish to promote his book or his work, but he started out working in a call center and realized that he was privy to a lot of very useful information, and he started writing down credit card numbers and names and addresses, and then that was noticed, so they stopped him doing that. So he got a very good memory. He remembered them and then would write them down when he left. So despite that mitigation, he was still able to get around the solution. So, and I've worked in various organizations over the years. We would have fraudsters targeting employees in bars or restaurants and trying to befriend them, trying to bribe them ultimately. So that unfortunately won't go away with digitalization, but monitoring what employees do, as our other panelists have said is vital. We would things like on your tech side, the people who are doing the coding, how much code can they write in a day? So there's tools that monitor productivity on that side to make sure people aren't pasting rogue code in. Code checks, both systematically and visual inspection, are vital as well. So the deep tech side, then you've got to have all of those procedures in place to make sure that the fraudsters don't manipulate them. But this is what they'll do. The more systematic solutions we put in, the more they will find the gaps around the edge, and the gaps are usually human, and that's where they will go. I know 2 fraud managers at UK banks who've ended up in prison because the fraudsters have managed to manipulate them and got them on side. So it's that behaviour from the fraudster will not go away.
Thanks, Nick. We have another question. We got 2 minutes left, so maybe a quick answer from one of you would suffice. Won't there be conflict with personal data protection or regulations like GDPR once the organizations start monitoring their staff behavior? How to find a balance in this case? Yeah, Ali, go ahead.
Actually, this is a very well subject. 2 minutes is not, of course, sufficient, and I'm sure the owner of the question would agree to that. But there are these concepts of purpose and proportionality analysis among all other requirements of GDPR. So a lawful use, purpose, and proportionality. So fraud surveillance falls under a lawful use under GDPR, which is either legitimate interest, legitimate business interest, protecting the organization from losing money. And the second legit use case, lawful use case, would be protecting the customer. So actually, lots of data can be used for fraud surveillance. But the purpose, now the second piece is purpose. That data should only be used for fraud surveillance purposes, shouldn't be taken out from the fraud system. Let's say if the customer is using an iPhone, there would be different risk than an Android phone, right? But do not take that information and process it for marketing analysis, right? So the second angle is purpose, lawful use, purpose. And the third is proportionality. So proportionality analysis has to be done. Okay, if this precaution, if this security measure really is proportionate to the risks. So are we processing too much of data just to prevent minor fraud incidents? Or is it proportionate? So this actually is itself a discipline to follow through lawful use, purpose, and proportionality. I would recommend especially European Council's documentation around GDPR. There are sections covering particularly fraud. There are sections covering biometry. I would refer to mostly the European Council's publications around GDPR and fraud use cases.
Thank you, Ali. I'll try to summarize a very interesting and lively discussion we had on this topic. I think we touched upon the digital onboarding. What do we mean by digital onboarding? That digital onboarding does not mean in all the cases removal of manual work. It could be assisted or it could be self. We also looked at risk related to digital onboarding and what could be the mitigating controls available to organizations to mitigate those risks. One key point which came out was we cannot rely on a single control at the onboarding stage. Rather, it has to be a layered control, a risk-based approach, wherein some kind of continuous monitoring would be very useful to prevent against frauds. And lastly, digital onboarding need not be restricted to customers. Rather, it can be used to onboard staff, contractors, vendors, and all. We were also able to explain the GDPR implications of employee monitoring. So thank you, panelists, Sujata, Nick, and Ali, for your time and contributions. With this, I'll hand over to Ola for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you for the informative panel. Last but not least, the panel discussion on trade finance fraud, money laundering, and beyond. Please welcome with me Mr. Jeffrey Wine, Head of Trade and Expert Finance Group at Sullivan. He will be moderating this panel. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome from a very cold, dark London. This, I think, is our final session, and it is headed Trade Finance Frauds, Money Laundering and Beyond. And let me just briefly introduce you to the panel speakers. We have Zul Javad, Chief Executive Officer at UAE Trade Connect, Carl Wegner, Chief Executive Officer, Contour Singapore, Diraj Kunwar, Managing Director of Business Banking at RAK Bank, and Alex Gray, Head of Trade and Transaction Banking at the London Institute for Banking and Finance, UK. Before I invite the panelists to speak, I thought I'd just open this discussion with just a few words of background, in some ways based on my experience of having worked in trade finance for many a year. And one of the first questions I sort of ask when I venture into the subject of fraud is, why single out fraud? And the answer is that if you look at the discussions that go on in relation to trade and trade finance, and the questions that our regulators invariably raise, is that they take a view, contrary, I think, to most of the practitioners, is that trade finance is inherently risky. And so the consequence, if you like, of that is they look at the headlines. And the headlines, sadly, are invariably around fraud. Has fraud risk always been there? Yes, but in reality, perhaps not that many. But generally speaking, when you have a fraud, they are large. And consequently, they make headlines. And that increases our focus on them. And in fact, I went back and looked at some of the frauds that were perpetuated a number of years ago. And one example I chose, which I won't name the names, somebody cleverly set up a duplicate business. Had a genuine business and a duplicate business. He brought in a large number of lenders. Some of the lenders were lending on the real business, and some of them were lending on a completely fraudulent duplicate business. And of course, ultimately the business collapsed and a lot of money was lost. And what some of the lenders then turned around to each other and they said, I didn't know you were in that deal. I didn't know you were in. And had I known that you were there, I would have known that there couldn't possibly be as much business as was there. Pointer number one. Second one, and I will mention this one partly because it sits in India and the Middle East, Solo Industries. Over 5 years or so, there were a few real deals in tin, but to satisfy the curious. Somebody wanted to kick the tires, there was a transaction. Over a number of years, it was built up with a number of banks being brought in. And then one day, having raised arguably in those days, a lot of money between 300 and 500 million, all the lines were drawn down and the money disappeared. What did people learn from that? Well, sadly, not a lot, because last year in Singapore, the oil trader Hin Leong used various methods to defraud banks. But the center points of all of this was reliance on forging key documents, non-existent inventory, selling the same inventory to multiple parties, inflating receivables, moving one fund to another, overstating inventory, forging sales invoices to secure factoring services from banks. A few little red flags there, perhaps. Agri-trade, using bills of lading that purported to be legal and valid, pledging them to the bank. Multiple bills of lading used for the same shipment, lots of money raised. And a large one that many of you know, just a couple of years ago, Jiangdong in China, fake warehouse receipts, raising hundreds of millions, possibly billions. I spoke to somebody in the market and his comment was, well, we knew this warehouse was doing this sort of thing. Why did people trust that warehouse? So the question to my panelists now is, here's lots of examples of what goes on. What sort of solutions are there? Are there technological solutions, blockchain, what else? What tools can we use to prevent this happening? Why are letters of credit singled out? The world is your oyster, gentlemen. Let's have your initial thoughts. Zal, can I ask you to kick off, please?
Thanks, Jeffrey. Yep. I'll kick off by giving a maybe 60-second overview of what UAE Trade Connect has been formed to take care of. So UAE Trade Connect is it's a consortium, a platform, which has been devised by a number of 7 banks in the UAE, and we've invited many of the other banks to join the platform. We have 6 banks currently in the onboarding process. So out of the UAE's trade finance lenders, soon we will have 13 to 15 lenders on the platform, which honestly represents potentially more than 80 or 90% of the trade finance volumes. The purpose of UAE Trade Connect is to help create a supplementary layer of fraud detection and risk mitigation. When I say supplementary, I'd like to double click on that by saying that some of the frauds which you put into your introduction would be identified by UAE Trade Connect, the ones that relate to, for example, duplicate financing, multiple lenders being involved with a party, etc. But honestly, it's not meant to replace the individual unilateral party level testing and checking that a bank should be doing. The purpose of UAE Trade Connect is to, in one sentence, it's to allow knowledge sharing without data sharing. And we have a unique technology which Contour also uses, which is blockchain. And with blockchain, we are able to capture information and have banks know that whether or not a similar transaction, a similar invoice, a similar warehouse receipt has appeared in any other bank for financing. And yet that data itself is not being shared between the banks, because that's the nature of the blockchain. It allows hashing, which is one-way hashing. It's not able to be unencrypted or decrypted. And it enables banks to know with comfort, with a degree of comfort, whether a certain transaction has appeared elsewhere in another bank in the history. So as time goes on, the blockchain gets longer, the data gets richer. And if somebody presents an invoice today, which was maybe financed as 6 months ago, 9 months ago, it'll be flagged as a red flag or as an orange flag. So I'll repeat what I said, that UAE Trade Connect and other platforms like ours should be considered supplemental. And we are at the beginning of our journey. We've only created one use case so far. Actually, the power of our network is about having banks working together in this very unique hashed way, creating a trust chain between each other that will enable future use cases to be deployed as and when the banks see that they can add value by doing so. Does that kind of summarize what we're doing and how we're trying to help with this problem?
Right. Yeah. No, that's I ticked the little box there to come back to you on that. Okay. Carl, your initial thoughts.
Great. Well, thanks for the invitation to be here. Yeah, similar. I mean, obviously, trade finance is brought up as a risky business, but actually it's not. If you look at the amount of trade that's done globally every day, sure, these cases that come up, they're in the news, they're big, but it's a little bit of, like they say, flying is a lot safer than driving, right? And when a plane goes down, it's big news, but when someone, a fender bender, no one, it doesn't become global news. So trade is actually inherently safe, but obviously, if we look at trade now, and now trade has become international, and I think the key thing is that a lot of it, the banks are still using paper documents, right? And to verify things. And paper, it works. It's a good standard. It's papyrus standard. It's been around for a while, but they can be copied now, right? And you see technology, the fraudsters are using technology to beat the banks by, again, you can do a copy of a document pretty accurately now. If the bank is just looking at a document as a piece of paper, they're not looking at it digitally. So the fraudsters are using digital technology to, they're using higher level technology than the banks, right? So digitalization of documentation is a way of making sure that data is unique. Contour is a platform. We're now working with 15 banks in 51 countries and managing letters of credit between these participants. Now, what we use is, again, decentralized technology, DLT, and it's the ability for everyone to manage their own database and not share. It's not a central database, which wouldn't work anymore. No one's going to let one central database own all this commercial data, whether it's the bank side or even the geopolitical side. So distributed ledger technology is a way to manage the multiple databases and keep them in sync. Now, one thing that again, if you have a platform, it's only as good as the ubiquitousness of the platform. So unless you have every transaction in the world on the same platform, to say we're going to stop double financing, well, when there's one platform globally, even if you have double financing platform in one country, well, the customers are, global trade is global. There's another country too. So you have to get both sides of it to really, but more digitalization does help this process. I think one thing we look at is the use of digital identities like LEI to make sure the customers, it goes back to something I said a little bit, you said it a little bit earlier about duplicate companies, right? LEI is a way, it's a global standard of managing the legal identity of the customers, of the corporates. We actually bring that into our, every one of our customers automatically gets an LEI. We help them register for it so that we know our customers are the actual corporate and they're the actual ones on the platform. So again, I think the digitalization allows, it's not going to, as I said, it's not going to completely, as I said before, it's not going to completely avoid fraud, but it's going to make it harder. And I think it's, as these platforms get more ubiquitous and be able to connect more, then there's a real chance of eliminating a lot of that, the obvious fraud or again, technology, taking advantage of technology.
Carl, thank you. I'm a fraudster. I'm interested, but I still think there's mileage in what I can do. Diraj, got some thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Ullah. I mean, my take would be a bit more granular and basic, application of common sense. And when we talk about trade finance fraud, and I handle small business for Rag Bank, and I can tell you there are far bigger frauds in the trade itself before it comes to trade financing with a particular bank. The supplier getting duped by the buyer and buyer getting duped by supplier, their email impersonification, that the email gets hacked, and instead of paying a genuine supplier, instead of paying A, you end up paying B. So those are basics that as a stakeholder we need to engage our potential client, and a lot of advisory. Before we get into the classic trade finance fraud and what can we do to mitigate, it will start from advisory, basic advisory that, use credential of your counterparties, check, the independent report of DNB or in likes of DNB to check who, because in this interconnected world, every trade discussion is happening on email, trade discussion is happening on business to business portals. So what do a vulnerable client do? So these are the things that as a bank, we encourage the client to be more content driven, to be more knowledge driven. And one thing which has happened, particularly in Middle East, that, the rebound vigilance around compliance risk. We end up checking a shipping route to check where is the end destination. And we figured out that there was no shipping at all. So incidentally, there are a lot of things discovered as part of our compliance check. And if you deep dive into various facets of risk, whether it's a credit risk or compliance risk or fraud risk, it's an unimaginable triangulation that ultimately every risk goes to a particular direction, that AML can take shape of fraud can take shape of sanction. And ultimately, it's a very difficult task for the bank, because today, double financing is easy to catch because, you have few numbers to run your algorithm around. But the real risk in trade finance fraud in Middle East that we see is the two-party collides. They are two different legal entities. There's no genuine flow of goods, but they end up getting financed. So those are the things that advent of technology like blockchain, where the entire shipping route will be on shared ledger. We see a great potential for trade finance in the region, because with the new technologies like UTC and the digital ledgers, we expect that the SME customer will have access to a platform where they can deal with original counterparties, they can see flow of goods, and that is the future.
That's the future, but it's not the present, is it? That's the problem. Alex, round off this opening set of comments.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff. Well, I've come from this from two sides, but my main work is with the London Institute of Banking and Finance, and in terms of education. But we've talked about not just about what LIBF can do. We have a qualification certificate of trade finance compliance, which covers fraud. But, that is over like 200 hours of work to be done to get a globally recognized certificate. But there's more work can be done on the lower scale. And this is what I worry about, is that because of the way that the world is now, that people are not sat beside each other in trade areas. I remember back into the early 1990s, where my first job in trade with HSBC, and you pick up these lessons and you share them with your colleagues. And it's one of those annoying things where your boss says something to you and it's like, oh gosh, yes, he's right. Because I said, oh, it's okay, we've got control of the goods because we've got the bill of lading, and it's in this place called Ceuta. And he goes, oh, where is Ceuta? And I said, oh, it's Spain. It says Ceuta, Spain. Everybody's smiling here because they know what I'm about. But it's a small part of in North Africa where the goods didn't always stay. And of course, he knew that. I was a newbie. I didn't know that, but I knew it then. And I also was sharing it with my colleagues, explaining these things. And I don't think these things are happening so much. Are we able to share, over a cup of coffee? We're not working beside each other. We're also not hearing what's going on so much. And there's that kind of, there's always talking about sharing. This is like very low tech sharing. Now Jeff, you and I, we come together sometimes on our annual trade finance compliance conference. And there's a lot of cases where we talk about these things. The more times that people can share these things. So at HSBC, we share these things internally. It's a big bank, but it's even better if you can share them, globally. But that's where the problem is, that banks aren't really willing to share when there's been problems. Fraud, when a fraud happens, you talked about the cases which hit the headlines. There are many cases which don't. In an ideal world, we could anonymize these things and share about these attempts, because a fraudster will attempt at one bank and may not get through, but he'll try another bank branch. And we had that regularly at HSBC. They would try Hong Kong, I would say central Hong Kong, they would try, then they go across the water to Mong Kok. And then if they went out there, they would go to Macau and then move further out. They would try everywhere and then they move to different banks. Whereas if people can get understanding of these things, that's more about the sharing side. And then, linked into that, I work also for TradeSun, a doc checking compliance AI service. And one of the things there is, and it links back to what Zul was saying, once again about sharing. In an ideal world, and what Carl was saying as well, the more ability that the regulators allow for sharing of information. So it's great to hear the advances are being made, because ideally, if you're on any platform, is you'll be able to see that a bill of lading has been financed. And in the region, in the Middle East, I was working at a case where there was double finance, but and that would have been if there was that information was shared. But then there's one of those going back to those basic type things where, which I asked the question when I was looking at this case, but of course this is because I had the benefit of the bad experience. It was the case of where are the goods? Oh, we have a bill of lading. Have you checked the bill of lading? And they find out it's a copy. Now, if they had taken action, maybe it was literally 4 months later, they thought, right, well, the goods are in India. We have a bill of lading. We're okay. But of course, the goods have been released. And that really goes back to talking about those experience, acting quickly. And that was one of those things I've learned just by bad fortune. You learn from that experience and share those with others. So acting quickly when there's a problem, act quickly, asking uncomfortable questions. So that's the kind of the angles I've got there, Jeff.
Interesting. Let me pick up one, because we're talking about global sharing of information. And listening to the last session, the last question was GDPR, data restrictions. We're sitting here saying that if we could share knowledge more easily, this would help solve fraud. I'm a lawyer. Is the law against this? But actually, it's not my fault. I didn't make these laws. I just have to work within them. Do the regulators actually completely fail to understand that because of bank secrecy, that in reality, they're permitting fraud in a way that if we could share data more, that would help?
Is it not about levels of secrecy? You're not talking about customer names and addresses and directors. You're talking about, and I maybe oversimplify things. If you have just a bill of lading number, a bill of lading has been financed, so you don't need to be sharing the rest of it. I don't know, maybe I'm oversimplifying. I have a tendency to do that.
Well, no, that's right. Anybody else on sharing thoughts?
If maybe Jeff, I can jump in. In the UAE, we have navigated this very carefully because our project was very much about what data can be shared, what can't be shared. Mm-hmm. Working closely with the compliance teams of the 7 banks, which were part of our consortium. We actually dealt with it in 2 ways. The first was we took the most conservative view of the data privacy rules, including GDPR and DIFC. And the UAE has recently, like this week, just enacted data privacy rules for consumers generally. So we took the narrowest view and made sure that we were operating at the lowest common denominator. And the second thing we did was we approached the central bank, and the central bank became actively involved with the steering of our project, admittedly as an observer rather than as a participant. But it helped us to ensure that as we were moving forward in developing what data can be shared and can't be shared, and I remind you, it isn't shared between banks. It is shared on a blockchain, which allows banks to know that data hasn't changed. And yet a very small fraction of the transactional data is moved into an engine in a central node that allows us to validate its duplicate status. So as Alex was saying, the checking is being done, at least in our case, at a transaction level rather than at a borrower level. And by checking transactions, what we're saying is, have we seen this document before, rather than have we seen this borrowing before? And that allows us to create flags and alerts, which are then given back to the banks for them to carry on their own investigations.
That's an interesting point.
It's encouraging that you've got the central bank involvement there, because that's where you need those kind of levels of involvement to help the whole process.
But you need the central bank involvement in every country, and then every central bank has to agree to, you know, a standard or a way to share between, because again, global trade is global, right? You can make sure there's no double financing in one country, but they'll go somewhere else. But there is some work. I know Singapore's been working with a few countries as well to talk about setting some standards to share some information. I mean, there's the regulatory part of it, which definitely needs to be done. There's also on the technical side, whether it's hashing or zero knowledge proofs, there are some technical ways as well to make sure there's not, you know, the same thing doesn't come up, the same document digitized instance doesn't come up twice. And zero knowledge proof is a way of being able to say, yes, I've seen that, but I don't even know what I'm saying I've seen, but the computers are doing the checking. But the regulators need to be involved in this. And this is the key thing, because it's a global issue.
And that's an important.
I think, you know,
sorry,
Jeffrey, you know, what Zul and UTC had pulled off is a very important milestone in the direction of how do individual banks share. But from the context of reporting fraud, right now the sharing of data within UTC is sharing of transaction level data. We are not reporting fraud per se. And how reporting fraud becomes tricky, because who decides who is the fraudulent party and who is the conspirator and who is the convict, and who is the victim and who is the victimizer. So when you report suspected frauds and it gets to a public domain and somebody claims that who decided that I am the fraudulent party, because remember, one of the trickiest part of trade finance is collapsing the layer between a trade dispute and an attempted fraud. Because one party thinks that it's a trade dispute, and the other party claims that I was defrauded. So that is where the lawyers like Jeffrey gets a lot of money, because you cannot settle this debate, right? Because, you know, unless the valid court of law has given the final verdict, and that takes years by the time the perpetrator has done enough fraud in the vicinity.
Yeah, I mean, I should point out, I don't have a vested interest in disputes. I'm not a disputes lawyer. My interest is actually in promoting good trade, because I think that's rather more. But you make a very, very good point that we're sitting saying, well, in this ideal world, this is what we would like to do, and there are all these competing problems that we have of privacy laws, data privacy. We have whistleblowing rights. The fact that if you get it wrong, if you report wrongly, as you rightly say, suddenly the banks are liable. And a lot of the problem is that the regulators think that the banks should police the world. And the banks are saying, we can't do this, help us on that. The blockchain type solution interests me because you know, I worked very recently on uniform rules for digital trade transactions. I think we all sit here saying that ideally we'd like to see trade digitalized, but we know in some ways that's years ahead. And I mean, two of you are working in essentially in consortia. In order to benefit from that information sharing, you have to join that club. And I think this is part of the problem, is club membership actually counterproductive to the world at large, because you can't belong to every club.
It's a great question, right? I mean, consortia and that whole idea of, you know, is consortia the right way to do this? Well, it's probably not perfect, but it's a start, right? Because, okay, let's just wait till all the regulators decide on a standard platform and they all 200 some countries in the world agree, and then we'll start. Well, our grandchildren will maybe see that, but it's not going to happen in our lifetime, right? So I think the key thing about consortia is to try to make it as open as possible, right? And we're lucky that our original 8 investors, now it's 9 investing banks. They encourage other banks to join. So they're not talking about, it's probably the same thing in UAE as well, right? You're not talking about exclusivity. You're not talking about something that's just for the biggest banks. Big and small should join, right? And I think the more forward-thinking banks realize that the more banks that join, the more powerful this network is going to be. And whether it's fraud, whether it's being more streamlined, the transparency of transactions, I mean, it's just going to be more powerful the bigger the network gets. So a consortium, membership is one thing. You have to be a member to log onto the platform, right? You're not going to let anyone who says I'm Mr. Banker on the platform. So you have to have some sort of membership and rule book. But I think the key thing is the inclusivity of bigger and smaller banks, and in different regions. We have banks from small banks in Vietnam. We have the largest trade banks in the world, and we're trying our best to make sure that this is as open as possible, because that makes the network more powerful. And again, working with other consortiums as well, right? There's not going to be one consortium to win all either, right? They're going to have to learn how to talk eventually.
Well, that's the point I wanted to say. The interoperability between the different platforms that currently is a barrier for a bank that wants to would have to join both UAE and Contour if he wants to benefit from the shared membership.
Well, again, I spent 4 years at a blockchain company where Corda, R3 Corda, where everyone talked about 4 years ago, we're not going to do anything until all the different blockchain systems are interoperable. And after about a year and a half of saying, how do we make this work? We realized, what do you mean, what is interoperable? You can't talk about interoperability till you have something to interoperate with. So I think interoperability definitely needs to happen, but there has to be enough transactions for the business case for someone to spend the millions of dollars to build interoperability too.
Yeah.
I know, Zul, what you think about that. No.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Carl. Interoperable is important in order to extend the reach of the networks. But I think certainly the approach we've taken is the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the value is already in our network or soon to be in our network, and that's a big win. And then also the 80-20 rule applies certainly in the UAE, where a lot of the trade finance that is being financed by banks is domestic. So while interoperability is important in terms of the international leg, if much of it is domestic, we're covering that through the existing and the coming use cases. So look, I mean, Jeff, just, I think the important point, and I believe Carl mentioned it as well, you can't boil the ocean in one go.
No, I accept that. Can I just turn to Dheeraj, because you were actually talking about the people who are really key to trade, which is the buyers and the sellers. We've just looked at platforms that are bank focused. What do we say to buyers and sellers in this fraud prevention world? What can they do? What do you expect the buyers and sellers to do?
Our platform is, we have many more, our members are buyers, sellers, and banks in our platform. So it's not just the banks. Okay. And so the banks are bringing on the corporates onto the platform. I think that's something in the future. I think corporates see the transparency as a benefit. They don't want to be involved in some of these industries, right, where there's been fraud. They don't want that to happen either, right? Maybe if it's not even to them, but all of a sudden their lines get cut or their interest rates go up because people say, I don't want to bank this type of commodity anymore, right? So I think the corporates as well want, more transparency and to cut down the fraud, because that hurts them overall.
No, okay, no, that's a fair point. Dheeraj, on the corporate, your corporate customer.
Yeah, I think there are two ways. If you see, the technology is evolving at two extreme ends. One end is being driven by likes of HSBC and Barclays to drive the high value trade and bring the corporates on the platform. And one side, the likes of Amazon and the likes of Noon in Middle East is trying to get an embedded platform to sellers and buyers.
Mm-hmm.
So if you in a typical SME mercantile trade, where you will buy from a wholesaler and wholesale buy from a broker and broker will buy from China, and then you in turn sell to a dealer and dealer sells to the retailer, that 6-party chain has broken to 3-party chain, where you have a B2B aggregator on one side and you order your goods. You can see the shipment on DHL, you can see the shipment on the various shipping agencies, and then you become seller on Amazon. Now, banks will be a fool if not to integrate to the platform and divide them the fruit of digitization. So more and more technology is getting invested in the trade flow. The beauty is, if you can see the flow, the fraud is naturally eradicated. The problem today is the flow visibility is opaque to both ends. The only one who see the flow is the shipping agency, who is not the interested party in the trade, because they will get paid irrespective.
And that's an interesting point, because that I was actually, as you were talking, we're talking about banks and we're talking about the logistics companies, the shippers, the warehouses. These are the people who are actually providing the tools and sometimes potentially providing the absolute means to defraud the market. Who issues the duplicate warehouse receipt? Who issues the duplicate bill of lading? It's not the banks. What should we do, Alex? Go on. What should we do about all these logistic companies sitting in the middle of all this?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because last week I was just explaining to our first-year students at our university at LIBF, trying to give them an insight into trade, because my concern is that not enough people are getting into trades, but certainly in the UK, and trying to explain to them how it all works and to cultivate an interest. And I talked to them about how, or as HSBC, we work very closely with DHL as an example, because they're, of course, they're moving around the bills of lading. But in terms of, you've got different scales of different logistics companies, and often when I've seen, say duplicate bills of lading or fake ones, it's not from the actual shipping company, it's somebody else that's making them. It's of course much easier now. When I started in '89, and the fake stuff was more obviously fake. But now that the fake stuff is very, very, very good, because we can all do it if we wanted to. We all have the tools right in front of us on our laptops to do these things. So that's where it comes into linking into some of those things. I don't think the logistics companies are so much responsible. I just think that what they have, the technology now, doesn't make it easy.
Yeah, what I'm interested, one of the points, we've got a question that I'd like to take, but when I talk to the more distinguished elderly trade finance bankers who do not want to move away from paper.
They want to touch it, don't they?
The touch.
And smell it.
Alex, we were at the same conference when those points were absolutely made. And it's quite interesting because you were talking about AI, the ability to detect fraud. And this guy said, I will never rely on AI because I want the feel and touch of paper. And that's like, we might, if we get a moment to come back to, I know we're running out of time. Somebody asked the question, is trade finance fraud the biggest financial crime in terms of transaction volume? What are the best practices for banks to prevent trade finance fraud? Interesting. They get the biggest headlines, don't they? Frauds get the biggest headlines.
It wouldn't be the biggest volume. It may be the biggest dollar amount.
Yeah.
Right, but definitely not, and certainly not volume.
It depends on how you look at things. How you classify counterfeiting. Is counterfeiting a fraud? Well, to some people it is because they don't realize they got counterfeit goods, but some people do. And I've done it. I've done.
Yeah, so that's a question of definition. But what's the best practice for banks to prevent trade finance? Why is it the banks that have to prevent trade finance fraud?
Well, in the session before, it was interesting, and they talked about collusion, because it's not only the banks, it's in the buyers and suppliers. And I've seen cases where, between the two ends of the transaction, there was obviously collusion, and the bank was being used as a vessel. But the banks are obviously easier to point the finger at, but there's a whole lot of people in the ecosystem that are doing it.
So what typically happens, Jeff, that when there's a limited ability of a particular client to raise money, and if he has otherwise intentions, they use accommodation and collusion as a means to finance. So two parties get together, make a fake invoice, show a lorry which does not have any goods, and raise the finance by illegitimate means. So what is bank's interest? Banks has to protect money. Bank is not doing out of their hobby or desire. They have no option, because they have to protect their own capital. And in the process, I think I will say that bank has also evolved last 10 years in terms of mandatory IMB checks, in terms of doing DNB reports on the counterparties.
Right.
But of course, there is a limited, bankers cannot become investigators. To that extent, you have to live with the business hazard of banking.
That links into what Jeff was talking about with Solo. I mean, they're still seeing cases, so people haven't been learning from the mistakes of the past. This was just amazing. The cases, a lot of cases happen where very good people having a tough time, and not supporting their families, but they're supporting a company where other people's families. So they're put into pressure, and that's where you have to recognize those signs as bankers, and ideally support the company so that they don't go into those fraudulent means.
As an outsider, I'm not a banker by trade. I dare say that actually banks have learned and do keep learning. It's just that your fraudsters get sharper and sharper. And I think one of the good things about digitization is that many of the transactions become more legitimate because they're coming from trusted sources. And I think digitization, although it's a threat, let's be open about that, it does create new opportunities for fraud. I think generally speaking, it allows, especially in the mass of transactions, that you will be able to create more and more algorithms to identify trusted sources, trusted parties, trusted validations. And I think there's a built-up knowledge, a cumulative knowledge that happens not just within banks, but now in the case of clubs or consortia, where all of this learning is being accumulated. So I think I see it, I'm very hopeful about the future rather than the other way around.
I would say, Duraj mentioned the triangulation of information, right? If we can digitize, the more that's digitized, the more it can triangulate and see where there's, again, AI, matching, whatever you want to call it. It sounds sexier if it's AI, but it's basically, being able to digitize and being able to look at multiple documents at the same time, or compare them, or compare where they were created. Does that make sense? Right? There's some logic to this that you can't do if it's a piece of paper. And to the ones that say that everyone, I like paper, it's safer. I remember, selling trade finance platforms in 2000, back when, this thing called the internet came out, and people said, well, I'll never put anything on the internet because someone's going to hack my computer. And I said, or even checks. I don't want direct deposit on my check because someone's going to hack hack and get into my banking system. Well, what takes more, more mind power? Does it take a really smart guy to hack into a bank's computer? Or how smart a guy does have to go to your mailbox and pull the envelope out of your mailbox at the end of the month, right? But people are used to certain risks, and they're going to have to get used to managing this new technology.
Sounds like the conversations I had with my father, Carl, about checks.
One small thing that we introduced way back 3-4 years, that you don't only assess the borrower for their funding requirement, $1 million or $2 million, you also put a cap on how much a per transaction should be, how much per supplier he can buy from. Sometimes it is restrictive and it is painful, but it also gives you a fair sense that is the client doing any disproportionate trade to his turnover. So those little nuts and bolts makes things a bit more apparent when a large transaction comes and UTC platform notifies us, or we ourselves.
That's a very useful point. The capping on amounts, which is the unusual size of transactions. Yeah. I think we've probably run out of time. Can I give you a minute each? Quick one-pointer summary. In many ways, Daraj, you've just done it. Size of amount sounds really good. Carl.
To start now, don't wait for everything to be perfect, because you'll learn on the journey.
Okay, I like it. Zal.
Yeah, I think build on what's been learned already, and move forward collaboratively. I think that's the key watchword for me.
Alex.
Yeah, and so linked into all that, educate yourselves, share information within your colleagues, and join these kind of sessions and hear about these kind of things. The more knowledge is shared around, the better. Beats the fraudsters.
I do like that as a summary. This sort of watch out for the real pointers. Share the knowledge. Let's get back to regulators and tell them we've got to be allowed to share the knowledge, because knowledge sharing is the best way to stop the frauds. Everything else we're doing, as I think Tal, you rightly said at the beginning, these are just tools to help. But looking at the bigger picture is what it's all about. I think that's it. Ola, I think you're back. Can I thank my panelists for a good, lively debate. I hope the audience that was useful. Thank you all very much. Have a good day, good evening, or wherever you are in the world. Ola,
thank you everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well done, Jeff.
Thank you for your valuable insights. With this panel, we come to the conclusion. We hope you enjoyed this informative webinar, and we look forward to welcome you in future events. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.